My name is Ken Long, and I'm a proud 31-year-old Canadian.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Maffedon, and I'm 31 years old, and I'm British.
My name is Andrea Garcia Rodriguez. I'm 25 years old, and I'm from Spain.
My name is Corey Flesser. I am 35 years old and from the United States.
My name is Claudia Maneggia, I'm 29 years old, and I'm from Italy.
My name is Martin Dimitrov, and I'm 28. I come from Bulgaria.
My name is Tanja Lacic, I'm 27 and I'm a Romanian living in Belgium.
Hi, my name is Güde Jensen. I am 31 years old and I am from Kiel, northern Germany.
Alice Biangalon. I'm 28, French.
My name is Mara Steinberger and I'm 35 years old. I'm Latvian.
My name is Januka Ciric. I'm 29 years old. I'm a European coming from Czech Republic.
My name is Ulrich. I'm 32 years old. I'm a Danish national living in Copenhagen.
My name is Don Cedar. I'm 31 years old and I have a Dutch nationality.
My name is Katerina Kurtisova. I'm 31 years old and I'm from Slovakia.
My name is Connor Hannigan. I am 26 years old. I am Canadian and I'm also a British citizen.
My name is Paul Nelke. I am 24 years old. I am from Munich in southern Germany.
My name is Diana De Viva. I'm 35 years old. I'm Italian.
My name is Dylan White. I'm 32. I'm proud to be Canadian.
My name is Beata Patashova. I'm Lithuanian. I'm 29.
I'm Eugenia Joni, 33 years old, and I am from Albania.
My name is Nadia Kovalchikova. I am a program manager and fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States.
My name is Finley Grimberg.
Hello, my name is Tobias Foxby. I am 19 years old from Florø, Norway.
Hello, my name is Philippe Lefebvre.
My name is Anvesh Jain.
Hi, I'm Laura from Hungary.
Hello from windy Istanbul.
The treaty we are signing here today is evidence of the path they will follow.
It shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty.
I've called it NATO 2030, and it has three priorities: keeping NATO strong militarily, making NATO stronger politically, and ensuring that NATO has a more global approach.
Good morning, good afternoon. Wherever you're watching from, welcome to the NATO 2030 Youth Summit. Over the next few hours, we'll get straight into the future of NATO, together with numerous senior leaders, numerous young leaders, as well as more than 900 participants. We'll be discussing how the alliance can remain ready today to meet the future challenges of tomorrow. Now, if you haven't had a chance to look at the programme, then please do so. You can find it in full detail at the Munich Security Conference website. But throughout the afternoon, you will be able to take part in different breakout sessions. So when the time comes, you'll be able to do that via the buttons 1, 2, or 3 on the right side of your screen. But please make sure that you always come back to channel 1 after the breakout sessions, because this is where the main joint events will be happening, and we'd hate to lose you. We're also going to get you involved early on by asking you various poll questions throughout the event to make sure that you can give us some short, snappy answers and that you're staying with us. When the time comes, you should be able to see the button on your screen, on the left-hand side of your screen, that says live polling, or the polling button. So please do take part, because we'd really like your input as much as possible. Just a quick word of advice, though. You'll only be able to participate in the polls if you're actually a registered participant. If you're watching via the live stream, please do also put your comments in via the hashtag NATO2030, and you're really welcome to keep the conversation going on social media, and I hope you will. So for those of you who are registered participants, we're going to test out your polling skills now, or rather we're going to test out our polling skills now, and we're going to ask you our first question. So if we could see it up on the screen, please. Our first polling question is: what are the main reasons why we need NATO? So what are the main reasons why we need NATO? And I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to answer that, so get thinking. We have some very clear opinions emerging here, which is good. I'm just going to give it a little bit longer. Keep the votes coming. And I think we will now close the poll. So if we could see the full results up on the screen, please. And it seems that we have an overwhelming winner there, because with almost half the votes, option D is the one that people seem to be the most inspired by. So NATO's reason for existing is that we need it to stand up for democratic values, followed closely by defending our territory, option C, and maintaining a strong bond between Europe and America, option F. So this is very interesting food for thought, and I'm sure we'll be discussing that as we go further on throughout the afternoon. In the meantime, one of the reasons why we're even here today is because the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, is very enthused by the idea of bringing young leaders into the discussion process of what NATO should look like in 2030. And Secretary General, I'm very pleased to welcome you, to welcome everybody in the audience more formally.
Thank you so much, Laura, and many thanks to the Munich Security Conference for organizing the NATO 2030 Youth Summit with us today. You are an outstanding platform for addressing future security challenges. Good afternoon, Europe, and good morning, North America. Let me start by congratulating Joe Biden on his election as the next President of the United States, and Kamala Harris as the next Vice President. I have worked with Joe Biden for many years, and I know him as a strong supporter of NATO and the transatlantic relationship. A strong NATO is good for Europe and good for North America. And I look forward to working very closely with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to further strengthen the cooperation between North America and Europe in the years to come. When NATO leaders last met, they asked me to lead a reflection on how to make our strong alliance even stronger, forward-looking and fit for the future. And that is why I'm holding this Youth Summit, NATO 2030 today. Because NATO 2030 is about your future, your freedom, and your alliance. When I was your age, I grew up in Norway. And my views and values were shaped by the world around me. We lived under the shadow of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear attack. But we felt safe because we were part of an alliance and trusted that our friends in NATO would always come to our aid. One for all and all for one. That solemn promise has kept NATO allies safe for more than 70 years. Today, NATO's core mission continues, preserving the peace and deterring aggression, on land, at sea, in the air, in space, and in cyberspace. From pandemics to infodemics, cyber attacks to climate change, our world keeps on changing, and NATO is changing with it. So in a more uncertain world, we need a strategy to deal with uncertainty. In a more contested world, we need a forum to settle our differences. And in a more competitive world, we need strength to tackle global challenges. For all these reasons, we need NATO. And let me explain why. First, if COVID-19 has shown us anything, it is that our world is more unpredictable than ever before. The only thing we can be certain of is uncertainty itself. When I was asked to become NATO Secretary General in early 2014, the world was a very different place. Few had heard of ISIS, and few predicted Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. Since then, Russia has continued its aggressive actions. We have seen new levels of brutality from ISIS and other terrorist organizations. And China has been asserting its economic and military weight on the world stage. We do not always know what the next crisis will be. But we do know that we are stronger together than alone. In times of peace or conflict, it is good to have friends. We have seen the value of our alliance in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, delivering much needed medical aid and supporting civilian efforts to save lives. In a more uncertain world, we need to strengthen international cooperation and the international institutions that uphold it, like NATO. And we need to invest more in our collective defense to defend the right of each of us to live our lives in peace and freedom. Second, in a more contested world, we need a forum for resolving our differences. It is no secret that NATO allies do not always see eye to eye. We have had our differences in the past, and we have them today. NATO provides a platform to bring allies together. So when we disagree, we can sit down together, speak together, and solve our differences. NATO is the only place that brings Europe and North America together every day. NATO is the place to discuss, decide, and act on issues that affect our shared security. And that brings me to my final point, that in a world of greater competition, we need strength and solidarity to address global challenges. Today's security challenges go beyond national borders. They cannot be addressed by any country alone, not even the biggest. Whether we are talking about the rise of China or climate change, the spread of nuclear weapons, or cyber attacks and disinformation, when we speak as one, our voice is louder. When we decide and act together, our words and actions are 30 allies strong. NATO brings together almost 1 billion people, half of the world's economic and military might. We also have a network of like-minded partners around the world, from Finland and Sweden to Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. So as we face even greater global competition, we must work even more closely together to defend our values and way of life, and to strengthen the global norms and institutions that have kept us safe and strong for decades. Faced with a more uncertain, contested, and competitive world, we need a strategy to deal with uncertainty, a forum for resolving our differences, and the strength to tackle global challenges. And that is why we need NATO, now, for the next decade, and beyond. You, tomorrow's leaders, both in North America and Europe, have the greatest stake in our security. So NATO 2030 is the chance for you to step up and safeguard your future, your freedom, your alliance. Now is the time for you to share your views and tell us your ideas. So welcome to the NATO 2030 Youth Summit.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Now, to help you on your NATO 2030 quest, you've handpicked a team of young leaders to advise you on how to strengthen the alliance over the next 10 years with a view to meeting the security challenges of the next decade. Now, there are 14 of these emerging young leaders. They've been handpicked or nominated by prestigious youth leadership programs from across the alliance, and they're all under 35. Let's meet some of them.
I would like to hear your views, to have your ideas, your proposals of how NATO can remain strong.
Alice Biangalon, French.
My name is Don Cedar and I have the Dutch nationality.
My name is Martin Dimitrov. I come from Bulgaria.
My name is Corey Flesser. I am from the United States.
My name is Andrea Garcia Rodriguez and I'm from Spain.
I'm Anne-Marie and I'm British.
Hi, my name is Gude Jensen and I am from Kiel, Northern Germany.
My name is Katerina Kirtisova and I'm from Slovakia.
My name is Tanja Lacic and I'm a Romanian living in Belgium.
My name is Jan Lukacic. I'm a European coming from Czech Republic.
My name is Claudia Maneggian and I'm from Italy.
My name is Mara Steinberger. I'm Latvian.
Hi guys, my name is Ulrich. I'm a Danish national living in Copenhagen.
My name is Ken Long and I'm a proud 31-year-old Canadian.
So thank you very much, Secretary General. Tell us, why was it so important for you to have this Young Leaders Initiative in the first place?
So I'm actually very delighted to be able to present the NATO 2030 Young Leaders Group today. And I appointed the group because I wanted them to help me, to assist me in making sure that NATO is fit for the future. So I'm very much looking forward to their ideas, their proposals, and I'm extremely grateful that they are all joining us today.
Well, I can see them up on the screen now, and I know you have many questions for them, so we're going to put a couple of them to them now. Would you like to ask your first question?
Yes, my first question is actually about climate change, because we know that climate change has security implications, and therefore we also need to address and discuss what is NATO's role in responding to climate change.
And I'm going to ask Katerina Kirtisova to answer this question.
Thank you, Secretary General, and I'm really happy that we are starting this discussion with a focus on climate change, which I consider to be one of the most profound challenges facing the alliance today. I think that politically, the 2 degrees debate should be as significant as the 2% debate we've been having. I think that NATO should dedicate more attention to climate-related security risks in its strategic communication strategy. Let's just imagine that we have a 2 degrees campaign that would be as widespread and as successful as the We Are NATO campaign has been. We have to remember that today member states' approaches to the relationship between climate change and security vary, and this has prevented the alliance from being able to reach a consensus on the matter. And it's not just the Trump's administration's climate U-turn, but it has also been the case in various Central and Eastern European countries. So I think that while the election of Joe Biden presents an opportunity to reinvigorate transatlantic cooperation on climate change, NATO also needs to get Central and Eastern European countries more engaged and to really lead by example and encourage all member states to advance emissions reductions and adaptation investment. And I think operationally, we can do more both on the prevention and on the response side. So just to give you one example, dealing with the root causes more effectively will require the alliance to increase organizational foresight, as well as to improve its analytical and risk and situational and threat assessment capabilities. And I think that also when it comes to the militaries in the field, we can go beyond their contribution to emissions reductions because they can also seek to reduce their impact when it comes to water and food. And I think just to conclude, we have to remember that climate change is not just a transatlantic issue, it is a global issue, and that NATO needs to work alongside not just the EU, but also other security and military institutions, as well as agencies in the field. And I think that sharing of expertise and training for locally engaged personnel is crucial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katerina. And our next question, please, Secretary General.
So my next question is about terrorism. NATO has been at the forefront in the fight against terrorism for many years. But that fight continues. Just recently, we have seen terrorist attacks in France, in Austria, and Afghanistan, and also in other countries. So the question is, how can NATO further strengthen its role in the fight against terrorism?
And that question goes to Corey Fleischer from the United States.
Thank you for the question, Secretary General. As we all acknowledge, addressing terrorism is complex, and NATO has made considerable strides in the last few decades to advance its counterterrorism efforts, mostly through education, engagement, and capability development. I think these efforts will continue to be central to the alliance, but it offered two shifts in NATO's role with partners to fight terrorism in the future. The first, NATO should work with its partners to examine new means of employing existing military capabilities to build the legitimacy of security actors and strengthen their relationships among local populations. These efforts should focus on eroding support for terrorist activity while demonstrating the security sector's role in upholding human security. The second is to prioritize engagement with women and youth as critical stakeholders in preventing and countering terrorism. These groups are not monoliths or homogenous, and they possess diverse perspectives that are instrumental to building community-level resilience to terrorist activities. Women and youth are attuned to the local drivers of support for terrorist groups, and their deliberate and meaningful engagement is also necessary for strengthening the relationship between the security sector and civil society. So NATO has a key role to play here as the military alliance. These two shifts in NATO's role with its partners, I think, can build on NATO's previous counterterrorism efforts, but they will also allow the alliance to adapt to the evolving nature of terrorism in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Corey. Now, Secretary General, this is so important to you that you haven't just kept your questions to yourself. You've also asked current NATO leaders or leaders of NATO allies to put their questions to the young leaders as well. And we're going to hear from a selection of them now, starting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel.
Sehr geehrter Herr Generalsekretär, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich grüße Sie alle, die Sie an diesem NATO-Jugendgipfel teilnehmen. Und ich danke Ihnen, dass Sie sich mit Fragen zur transatlantischen und globalen Sicherheit auseinandersetzen. Und das in einer Zeit, in der uns durch die Coronavirus-Pandemie große Sorgen bereitet werden. Das ändert aber nichts daran, dass wir auch andere große Herausforderungen im Blick behalten müssen. Vor 30 Jahren wurde Deutschland wiedervereinigt. Kein eiserner Vorhang teilte mehr Europa und die Welt in Ost und West. Doch das Ende des Kalten Krieges bedeutete mitnichten das Ende von Bedrohungen. So manche Krise, gerade auch vor Europas Haustür, Terrorismus und hybride Kriegsführung, erfordern neue Antworten. Verschiedenste Entwicklungen, nicht zuletzt im Zuge des Klimawandels, können rasch sicherheitspolitisch relevant werden. Frieden, Freiheit und Stabilität zu bewahren und unsere Werte, auf denen unser Zusammenleben gründet, zu verteidigen, das ist und bleibt der Auftrag der NATO. Wie aber kann die Nordatlantische Allianz ihrem Auftrag unter geänderten und sich weiter ändernden Bedingungen gerecht werden? Wir wollen Antworten auf diese grundlegende Frage geben. Zum einen mit dem Reflexionsprozess mit Experten und zum anderen mit einer gesellschaftlichen Diskussion zur NATO 2030. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie sich in diese wichtige Debatte einbringen. Und ich bin schon sehr gespannt auf Ihre Vorstellungen und Anregungen dazu, wie wir die Akzeptanz der NATO, gerade auch bei jüngeren Menschen, stärken können und wie wir unsere Allianz auf die neuen Herausforderungen vorbereiten können. Viel Erfolg bei Ihren Beratungen und herzlichen Dank für Ihr Engagement.
And I'm going to ask Tanya Lacic to answer that question.
Thank you. I'd like to answer this question by telling you about this microscopic animal, which is rather obscure. I only learned about it by watching David Attenborough, of course. It's called the tardigrade, and it's quite a remarkable animal. Tardigrades are really one of the most resilient animals out there. They survived all 5 mass extinctions and are over 500 million years old. Now, I don't know if NATO will live to see its 1 millionth year old, but I do think the tardigrade can teach it some survival lessons. So how does the tardigrade survive all possible environments from radiation to outer space? Well, it not only adapts, it super adapts. Now, NATO also knows a thing or two about adaptation, but right now, NATO needs to adapt not only on one front, but on multiple fronts. For one, NATO needs to address new social demands from increased polarization to shifting priorities. NATO needs to also address invisible threats from pandemics to bots. And NATO also needs to fortify alliance cohesion at home. But maybe most importantly, NATO needs to get creative about how it uses its power. So NATO not only needs to become a creative super adapter, but I also think that NATO could use something called a damage suppressor. Now, ironically, this is not something that NATO officials came up with, but rather it's the unique protein that has kept the tardigrade alive all these years by basically keeping its DNA intact when facing all these threats. Now, NATO's DNA is made of its values and it's made of solidarity. So NATO, let's adapt, but let's make sure our DNA also stays intact. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And our next question comes from Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
Hi everyone, bonjour à tous et bienvenue au Sommet de la Jeunesse OTAN 2030. Je dis toujours que les jeunes ne sont pas seulement les leaders de demain, vous êtes déjà des leaders d'aujourd'hui. From the security implications of climate change to combating disinformation and now dealing with the threat of the COVID-19 pandemic, your voices, your opinions, and your leadership are more important than ever before. So thank you for getting involved and stepping up. Ensemble, on va bâtir un monde plus sûr, plus juste et plus inclusif pour aujourd'hui et pour demain. Now, today I want to discuss disinformation and the threat that it presents to democracies around the world. As you all know, the spread of disinformation has drastically increased in the past decade. Social media, while contributing a lot of good to our daily lives, has also increased the amount of false, misleading, and inflammatory disinformation that our citizens see every day, which has contributed to an erosion of trust in our democratic and international institutions. So my question to all of you is this: how can institutions like NATO and democratic countries help in the fight against disinformation so we can ensure countries can build back a better society for everyone?
And that question goes to Kevin Vuong.
Well, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. As you know, NATO as a collective is a force to be reckoned with. We're 30 countries that will be home to nearly 1 billion people by 2035. And if NATO was a country today, we'd have the 3rd largest population and the 2nd largest economy, with a GDP per capita that's nearly 2.5 times the global average. So let's leverage our collective power for our collective defense against disinformation. There are NATO standard rounds that our militaries use, And we do that to maximize interoperability. So let's create a transnational standard that can guide companies, governments, and perhaps most importantly, the citizens of democratic countries to fight disinformation. In the absence of this, we leave it up to various companies, as we've seen on social media, to set their own. And these inconsistencies are vulnerability that can be exploited by our adversaries. So, Mr. Prime Minister, I hope that you and other leaders will stay tuned for the robust set of recommendations that my peers and I will prepare over the next couple of months for combating disinformation and how we can build back better together.
Thank you, Kevin. And our next questioner is Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to Jens Stoltenberg for inviting me to speak at this NATO Youth Summit, and to all of you for taking part. Today, you're going to hear about the amazing work that NATO does and how for more than 70 years, this alliance has acted as a giant shield of solidarity, protecting 1 billion people in Europe and North America. And yet, if NATO is going to guarantee our peace, liberty and prosperity for the next 70 years, we must respond to emerging threats and challenges. One of the biggest is the way new technologies are transforming every aspect of our lives. So, there are two questions I want to put to you. How can the Alliance best use technology to help create a safer world? And what more can we do together to stop others from exploiting our own growing dependence on technology? Addressing those two questions will, I believe, help to ensure that NATO continues to keep us safe in the future, and I wish you every success with today's event.
And those two questions go to Jan Lukasiewicz.
Thank you for those questions, Mr. Johnson. So let me answer them. For the first questions, there are multiple areas where technology can help us create a safer world. Let's name a few. I think we should use the newest AI and big data technology tools to make data-driven, better, and swift decisions. Swiftness appeared to be very recently, during the COVID-19 crisis around the world, a crucial deciding element. Moreover, these tools can help us tackle ongoing information hybrid war. Secondly, we should focus on new domains such as cyberspace, the actual space, which provide us with opportunities to expand our knowledge, technology, scientific, and military advantage. Last but not least, I would put stronger emphasis on elementary and applied research and technology transfer. NATO membership states have a huge know-how and brain pool which can brew brilliant and useful solutions we may need in future. To answer your second question, I think we should focus on education. It is a great paradox that the more we are dependent on technology, the less we understand it. As an alliance, we should change that. Technology shouldn't be a black box, which allow people to be manipulated and confused. Especially in this disturbing world with chaotic information. NATO should help provide solutions and tools that would help us educate people to be independent, informed, and a lot harder to be manipulated.
And thank you very much, Jan. And Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General, is still with us in the studio. Jens, tell me, what is it that you've picked up on so far from the discussion that you find interesting?
As in one way, I think the most important message is that there are so many different issues NATO has to address at the same time, from technology, disinformation, collective defense, climate change, terrorism, and many other issues. And they are different, but they have one important thing in common, and that is that for NATO to succeed, we need to be able to change. So kind of permanent change, permanent adaptation is the key to NATO's success, and that's also the main purpose of NATO 2030 is to make sure that we are changing and that we're listening to young people as we are becoming fit for the future.
Thank you very much. We're now going to go to our next questioner, which is Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
This year, my country celebrated 75 years of peace and freedom. Since the end of the Second World War, children have been able to grow up peacefully in the countries that make up the NATO alliance. Today, you might wonder, do we still need NATO? And the answer is, yes, we do. Because we cannot take our freedom for granted. It's true that since the end of the Cold War, freedom and democracy has spread further around the world. But the free and liberal societies of NATO's member countries and its many partners across the globe are not immune to outside threats. Today's dangers are different from those the world faced during the Second World War or the decades in which your parents grew up. Nowadays, we have to defend ourselves not only against guns and bombs, but also against new threats. Threats that are often invisible and can easily cross national borders. Your phone, your computer, your email, and your social media can all be hacked and used against you. To counter those threats, we need to work together. We need to work within NATO, but NATO also needs to work with other partners like the EU. And of course, we need to work with you, the younger generation. We need your technical expertise, your knowledge, and your networks. So let me be frank and ask you this. What can you do as someone with specific knowledge and skills to make sure we can live in freedom after 2030? I hope we can count on you. Thank you.
And that question goes to Gude Jensen.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. As the chair of the Committee on Human Rights and Humanitarian Aid in the German Bundestag, my experience taught me and continues to teach me every day that freedom needs to be defended both on a smaller and a larger scale. For the smaller scale, it is fighting for the release of one single prisoner. It is demanding justice for a killed journalist because of his or her work, or it is supporting in work and in action people who are fighting for the future of freedom in Belarus, in Hong Kong, or elsewhere. Because these small things, they matter. Every square inch we can take back of the shrinking space for civil society worldwide matters for the sake of freedom. And when it comes to the freedom in the digital age, we need to be aware that every single piece of legislation that is passed here with the rule of law in our countries, it may also serve as a blueprint for authoritarian regimes. This is a sphere where I can and will continue to work for freedom with a lot of my colleagues from across other parties. On a larger scale, and that is as important, we need a new emphasis and a new discussion about defending Western values, our values, the NATO alliance's values. We need to talk honestly about which countries may play a long game in strategically undermining our freedoms in the world. And we need ways to approach these challenges. Of course, there are questions that fall behind in day-to-day politics, especially during a pandemic. So this is what I'm already doing and will continue to do. Reminding my government in Germany, but also elsewhere, initiating discourse like this in the media and pressing for a position when it comes to dealing with global powers such as China or also NATO members such as Turkey. More than ever before, we are dependent on partners if we successfully want to conquer these crises. This is why we need to talk about how NATO, not only as a defense alliance, but also as a multilateral institution, can help shape and conquer these crises and challenges. I'd like to take a little part in that endeavor as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gude. And our next question comes from Estonia and President Kersti Kaljulaid.
Hello, future leaders of NATO. New technologies have already changed the face of conflicts and warfare. For example, we already see how the use of drones has shifted the balance not only in asymmetric conflicts, but now also in conventional warfare. But it doesn't stop here. Artificial intelligence may well undermine the technological edge of the West. What will we do if our adversary's AI turns out to be smarter than ours? In the past, it was usually the state and the military that drove technological innovation. Nowadays, innovation is shifting more and more to tech companies. We already see how some of our global competitors are effectively combining state and private sector resources in AI development. Hence, my question to you. What could NATO do so that the West won't end up as the biggest loser in this new technological race.
And that question goes to Andrea Garcia Rodriguez.
First of all, I would like to unmute myself and then thank Madam President of Estonia for the question. I believe that NATO should, first of all, anticipate the next technological revolutions. And I'm not only speaking about AI, which is something that is already having an impact in our lives and in our security, but also on the new emerging technologies such as quantum computing that is, if not now, will definitely disrupt our security environment soon. Second of all, I would like to respond saying that we need to strengthen our cooperation and we need to strengthen NATO in order to be able to face these new challenges arising, as Madam President of Estonia said before. And this is cooperation strengthened passes not only for like creating new defensive capabilities, but also pooling resources and certainly creating new offensive capabilities in certain domains, such as the cyber domain. We cannot guarantee defense if we do not build offensive capabilities as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. So, Secretary General, you're still with us as well. Could you, what are your thoughts on the technology race, and particularly artificial intelligence, and how it's going to change the landscape in the run-up to 2030? But what also you think NATO should be doing to get ahead of that technology race?
So I very much think that new disruptive technologies as artificial intelligence, but also many other technologies, they are now fundamentally changing the threats and the security challenges we all face. Actually, I believe that these technologies are changing the nature of warfare as much as the Industrial Revolution changed the nature of warfare a couple of centuries ago. And of course, NATO has always had the advantage of having a technological edge on all other potential adversaries or competitors, and we need to be able to make sure that we keep that technological edge when we now see such profound changes taking place. This is partly about investing, partly about one of the reasons why we need to invest more in our security, so we have the resources to develop new technologies and to keep this edge. But it's also very much about being able to work together, governments and private companies. And one of the big advantages we have in NATO is that we are 30 open, free societies with dynamic, competitive economies. And I think that's actually one of the best bases we have for being able to develop new technologies.
Thank you. And we're now going to go to Spain for our next question, and Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez.
In 2022, Spain will celebrate the 40th anniversary of its accession to the North Atlantic Alliance. This represented the first milestone of our new democracy, rejoining the international community and the starting point of an increasing responsibility in the international arena, always based on multilateralism and rules-based order. Much has happened in these 40 years, and the world has deeply changed. Globalization is the hallmark of our times, and we have always believed that NATO, that unites democracies that share common principles and values, must be a driving force of stability also in our neighborhood. That is why my country, Spain, has always strived for a sound partnership policy, for instance, with our Mediterranean partners. We believe that security is a two-way street, so that the more resilient our partners are, the better we can ensure security in our societies. Today, more than ever, we depend on each other. So I would like to know how we can deepen these association programs from a multilateral perspective in order to improve what we do and how we work together. Thank you.
And that question goes to Ulrich Troller-Schmed.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for the question, and thank you, Secretary General, for inviting us to be here today. I think my answer for how we work abroad should start at home. Is NATO an institution or a community? If we merely see it as an institution, we will bury our values in administration. But if we see NATO as a community of democracies, we have opportunities for adaptation. It's time maybe to say what we stand for at home. and band together with other democracies abroad. We're no longer bound by the Cold War in Europe. It's time to recommit to free institutions for the 21st century that we use it to bind us together as allies at home, and then stand in solidarity in the face of authoritarian challenges to free peoples abroad and to the challenges that they might have. So what can we do? Well, first of all, for the Southern neighborhood, we can bring the African Union closer. Second, we can give the EU a seat at the table of the North Atlantic Council. Third, we can consider letting other democracies maybe even ally with NATO or join NATO, Japan, Australia, Mexico. It's bold ideas, but if we don't dare talk about innovation, we will avoid potential tension, but we will also risk losing our economic foundation, security, and values in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrich. And our final head of state question comes from Zuzana Čaputová, the President of Slovakia.
I find it highly important to engage our young and bright, as one day it will be you setting the course and taking the decisions. One of the key topics we have been discussing in recent years is how to make our alliance politically stronger. Because to truly adapt to the dynamics of ever-changing world is not only about increasing military power. It is equally about investing in our unity and credibility. And this comes from the ability to act as one and swiftly, when needed, to protect our freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, to defend our peoples, and to maintain the trust of our citizens in our efforts. Thus, my question to you is this. In 2030, what will a truly politically strong alliance look like? What must we do today to make it happen? Thank you, and I wish you fruitful discussions.
And that question goes to Don Cedar.
Thank you so much, President. As the world's most powerful defense alliance, a politically strong alliance is crucial for the future and continuation of not only the NATO, but for ensuring a stable world. As we grasp this moment to reflect on where we see our alliance 10 years from now and how it will continue to keep us safe, I would like to contribute 3 quick points that we need to look to today to enhance the alliance. First of all, it will require a reassessment of the NATO's core values. Not only the times, but also the threats and the interests have shifted, and it is crucial to, while keeping the diplomatic ties intact, reassess why the NATO should be more relevant than ever and what it truly is that binds us. Shared values create trust, strength, a sense of belonging, and it is crucial that we re-examine openly and agree for the future on what basis the NATO countries should strive to move the alliance forward. Second of all, we need to raise awareness among the citizens of the NATO alliance countries. It is essential that we engage the community so that the alliance maintains, adapts, and grows a strong democratic support in all the alliance, in all the countries of the alliance. And third and lastly, to uphold its mission to strengthen the transatlantic cooperation, we need strong societies. We need to invest in each other, in democratic processes, but also in combating disinformation to make sure that we as individual NATO countries can be stable and therefore can provide for a stable and strong NATO. I truly believe that by sowing a seed today, we will be able to reap the harvest of a strong NATO in 2030. As the NATO young leaders, we will try to provide the NATO the next couple of weeks with some well-thought advice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Don. Secretary General, just to wrap up in this discussion, what would a politically strengthened alliance look like in 2030? And what did you think of what Don had to say on that matter?
So first of all, I think that it's a bit early to conclude, because the whole purpose of NATO 2030, the work of the Young Leaders Group and the whole process is to actually get some proposals, some ideas, some input to help us shape and change NATO so we are fit for the future and that we are ready to also be a strong alliance in 2030. So this is a starter process, a bit early to conclude the process. I'm looking forward to the proposals from, for instance, the Young Leaders Group. Having said that, I think there are some key issues that have to characterize NATO in 2030. One is that it has to be military strong because we face new and more challenging threats and evolving security challenges. And therefore, we need to invest both in military capabilities, but not least also to keep our technological edge. Then we need to strengthen NATO as a political alliance, and that's exactly about how we work with partners all over the world, in Europe, but also globally. And it is about how we address differences between NATO allies. There is no way to hide that sometimes NATO allies disagree, but then we need to be able to sit down and find solutions, ways to deal with our differences. And the third aspect, which I think is extremely important for NATO, is that we should remain a regional alliance, Europe and North America, but we need to have a more global approach, taking into account the fact that, for instance, the rise of China is changing the global balance of power. And that matters for NATO. And we see that China is coming closer to us, investing in our infrastructure. This is about resilience in the Arctic, in Africa, and of course in cyberspace. So we need to respond to the fact that more and more of the challenges we face are global, and therefore NATO needs a global approach.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our young leaders for your answers. Thank you very much to the current NATO leaders for your questions. Stay with us, because after the break we'll be doing a scenario building exercise on what the world in 2030 will look like. But please stay tuned after the short video.
Hi, my name is Kevin Long, and I'm a proud 31-year-old Canadian. NATO is peace, NATO is security, and NATO is safety. I believe is a weaponization of disinformation. To listen and learn and share best practices.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Maffedon, and I'm 31 years old and I'm British. NATO stands for community, collaboration, and a progressive approach to life. Getting to understand and hear the perspectives and the stories of different folks from across NATO nations.
My name is Andrea Garcia Rodriguez. I'm 25 years old and I'm from Spain. Cooperation and multilateralism. Climate change and technological disruption. Insightful and passionate conversations about the future of technology and security. Democracy.
My name is Paul Nelke. I am 24 years old. I am from Munich in southern Germany. In 10 years, I hope to be in a position where I can make the world a little bit more safe and a little bit more secure. NATO matters because in times like this, with a lot of insecurity, it's important to have friends and allies. Freedom.
It's now time for our scenario building exercise. What will the world look like in 2030? But before we do that, and to get you in the right frame of mind, it's time for our second poll question. And that question is, what will be the main security challenges facing NATO in 2030? What will be the main security challenges facing NATO in 2030? Please vote now. And we are going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So if we could close the poll, please. And as we can see from these results, there's an overwhelming view amongst our participants today that cyber and new technology threats, as we've been hearing already throughout this afternoon, are going to be the biggest challenge that NATO faces in 2030. Well, that's plenty to chew over for the session that's coming up with the world in 2030. And it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to our moderator for that session, Ian Bremmer, who joins us from New York. Ian is the president and founder of Eurasia Group and also Gezerah Media. Ian, over to you.
In the 21st century, we are all on the front line. In the 21st century, we are all on the front line. In the 21st century, we are all on the front line. State and in the 21st alike, misinformation as a political weapon, forced migration and resource scarcity brought on by climate change, and the COVID pandemic, the greatest global crisis since World War II and the founding of NATO, has only exacerbated those threats. In a G0 world, no country or group of countries alone can meet the global challenges of our time. Inequality continues to widen in most nations as governments turn inward and populism rises. Multilateral institutions are looking beyond states for solutions to today's challenges and must confront the economic, geopolitical, and technological realities that will define life in 2030.
Hello to all of you. I'm Ian Bremmer here from New York City, and now we get to hear from you on some of views of where the scenarios for the world in 2030 that NATO has to adapt and align towards are heading. In a radically changing landscape, what I call a G0 world, we are seeing great divisions in the United States playing out with the election that we've just had. Less inclination for the United States to be the global policeman, the architect of global institutions, the cheerleader of global values. A divided post-Brexit Europe. Russia in decline, but still very hostile to the interests, values, and standards of the United States and European allies, and blaming the West for much of their decline. China rising, but increasingly building its own competitive architecture to that of the West. How much the world is likely to change in the next 10 years, we're already seeing on the back of coronavirus, the largest crisis of our lifetimes, extraordinary acceleration in trends of global inequality, in a decoupling of the United States and China, particularly on the technology front, with difficulties for other countries to continue to hedge and balance between the two, and technology disruptions because the companies that are most innovative are the ones that, like we're using today, are most capable of getting us out of this crisis. With so many variables at play, we want to take the next 15 minutes to widen the lens a little bit and talk about what we need to do to prepare for the world of 2030. 3 themes that we want to dig into and get your views on where we think the world is heading. First, one about the economy. Second, one about the global balance of power and its shifts. And third, one about the changing threat landscape. Taken together, these 3 themes will determine the most likely scenarios defining the world that NATO will operate in 10 years' time. So let's start with the economic forces shaping the future world. And the key uncertainty here is, will the global economy in 2030 be less globalized than it is today? Will it be more regionalized, increasingly automated, reducing incentives for global cooperation? Will it keep most countries looking more and more inward? So I want to prompt the first of 3 polls that we're going to use here for each of these sets of variables. And please use the live polling button on the left-hand side of your screen to submit your responses. It's available to registered participants only. On the left-hand side of your screen to submit your responses. It's available to registered participants only. The first question in 2030, what best describes the global economy? Is it highly globalized as governments effectively tackle inequality and level the playing field? Is it governments viewing globalization through a strategic lens, with supply chains now reflecting national security concerns, are geopolitically motivated, more strategic, more vulnerable to weaponization? Fragmented globalization, data, trade, capital flows remaining vibrant, but mostly not at the global level, or for economic nationalization prevails as governments respond to destabilizing inequality and throwing up more barriers. As you're voting, and we'll let you take some time, let me just mention a few variables to consider and some implications for NATO. First, big one, access to technology. The lines between economic winners and losers may well become starker and increasingly defined by access to and control of emerging technologies. Think about how we're moving towards more of a surveillance capitalism type world. And the fourth industrial revolution, more innovation, versus the post-industrial revolution, I'm left behind. At the same time, much more access to digital technology for everyone because there's so much more investment in innovation to get people access to smart agriculture, biotech, and smart education, distance learning. Inequality, barring significant government interventions, inequality could easily get much worse in most NATO countries as labor force participation falls, and that could erode social contracts in the West. Finally, globalization and regionalization. The future of globalization could take multiple forms. One potential likely outcome is supply chains and trade agreements become primarily oriented around regional blocks, while on the tech side could truly bifurcate, the splinter net becoming the splinter net of things, anything with a chip in it. Okay, you've now had some time to vote, and overwhelmingly, you all think that we're going to see globalization through a more strategic lens, supply chains reflecting national security concerns. Now, if that's the case, then clearly NATO is going to become much more relevant as an economic institution, that the technology sector is going to become more strategic for all NATO allies and is going to align more with a nascent military, industrial, technological complex. Lockheed being in some ways the most strategic, too big to fail company back during the Cold War. How about if Amazon looks like that in 2030? That seems to be what you are implying from your response to this poll. Okay, let's switch to the second section, the global balance of power. We talk about this an awful lot. The key uncertainty here is, does NATO have less political, technological, and economic power in 2030 relative to China and other emerging rivals? Does it still have the edge in military and soft power? So here's your poll. Which of the following four best describes the global balance of power in 10 years' time? Is it first, a reinvigorated US-led liberal international order? I just saw the cover of Der Spiegel. Those guys are certainly saying that with President Biden coming on. Is it a multipolar global order underpinned by strong global institutions and diffuse power centers, more of a concert? Is it a new Cold War with competing spheres of influence around technology, economic, and security blocks? At last year's Munich Security Conference, there was a lot of talk about that. Or is it the emergence of a Chinese-led global order? Again, you're voting right now. As you continue to vote, take a look at those options. Couple things that are worth thinking about. First, maybe the world has exited a G0, an absence of global leadership by 2030, but there is clearly an enormous amount of uncertainty around what comes next. Could we conceive of G2 between the United States and China? Has the damage of the G0 world to global institutions and multilateralism been repaired? What kind of new architecture is emerging to deal with new challenges like climate, like cyber, like data and AI? And how does that affect the geopolitical order? And let's keep in mind that liberal democracy is not the unifying force it once was, either globally or even inside NATO, and leaving NATO countries more politically fractured because of the decline of public confidence in democratic governance. Not only that, but the gravitational pull of Chinese trade and investment. Finally, NATO is probably going to struggle to balance divergences between member states and security issues like the Eastern Mediterranean, where there's a lot of political disagreement within NATO itself, Turkey on the one hand, Greece and Cyprus on the other, that sort of thing could become a lot more frequent. Okay, let's look at what you say here. Closer than the first poll, but very few people think that China is about to become the leader of the global order. Even fewer of you think the United States could actually lead a reinvigorated liberal international order. Kind of extraordinary that you'd see only 3% of respondents on the back of Biden becoming president saying that could happen. G0 for longer. Most likely you see, my goodness, a new Cold War with competing spheres of influence around technology, economic, and security blocks. How much have we not learned from the course of the last generations? Important point here would be, how can NATO members be forced to balance their desire to benefit from China's growing economic heft against commitment to democratic values and the idea that a Cold War is coming? Another thing I would say is that the fact that global institutions are becoming weaker clearly makes NATO more relevant in this kind of an environment, gives it an opening to strengthen its influence if it grows more attuned to these threats and these changing geopolitical realities. Final thing is, if a coalition of democracies like the D10 emerges to fortify the post-world order against future challenges, NATO is clearly going to be looked at as source material for its design. Okay, the last section for you, and that is the future threat landscape. I already saw a similar poll that you did just before this session. The key uncertainty here is, to what extent is the immediate threat landscape in 2030 primarily defined by cyber warfare, tech-driven misinformation campaigns, and climate-induced disruptions? New threats. So here's your poll. What are the biggest risks for NATO in 2030? Same as ever. Russia, Russia, Russia. We keep talking about that an awful lot. Or is it new adversaries? China posing the primary threat to NATO in 2030. The real risks come from within. Only NATO can hurt NATO. We face an identity crisis because we're so different and the Americans don't want to lead as much. Or the most salient risks come from cyber attacks, misinformation campaigns, and climate-related disruptions. You're voting? And let me just say that cyber could well emerge as the main form of warfare by 2030, changes certainly how one would think about budgeting, about the orientation and spending on defense. Also, China may emerge as far more of a threat via cyber and other means than Russia. Tech capabilities are extraordinary. In fact, today, in many ways comparable with that of the United States. China has a much bigger data market. The Americans have more scientists, have better scientists for now. A lot of people believe that data drives better AI. Some don't. If it turns out that the data folks are right, NATO could be in trouble. What does that mean for power asymmetries as well between the United States, which has all the tech companies, and all the NATO allies? Finally, the greatest systemic challenges to individual safety, health, and prosperity could increasingly come from transnational global challenges like climate rather than old threats like interstate war. Does that make NATO as a sub-global organization more challenging in being able to respond? Okay, let's see what you say here. Well, not a surprise that far more of you, 17%, think that China poses the primary threat than Russia does. So a very big shift for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But even more of you think that the real risks come from inside NATO, an identity crisis, so much growth in issues of division inside our own societies. If we don't fix those, so hard for the institutions to work. But the most important point here, over 50%, 56% saying the most important risks are the new risks. They're global risks, and many of them may not be coming from countries at all. They could be transnational, they could be non-state actors, and they could come from climate-related destructions. You know, a couple things I would say about this. NATO may well require, if this is right, a new organizing principle that encompasses all the threats facing the alliance in 2030. Give you an idea here. Is the opening Arctic theater a reminder of NATO's relevance, or instead the only issue of the future that NATO might be better suited than other institutions to address? In other words, is the Arctic NATO's fountain of youth, or is it the nursing home? Finally, NATO needs to decide which part is less relevant to the challenges of 2030. Is it the North Atlantic piece, or is it the treaty organization piece? I mean, the North Atlantic piece neglects that most growth, tension, and action are increasingly occurring in other places, as you've made clear in your responses, while the latter neglects that today's asymmetric challenges defy the logic of red lines that trigger collective defense obligations. Okay, final point. I want to give you a little prompt to do a world cloud exercise. Taking everything we've just talked about over the last 15 minutes and put it all together, write up to 10 words in the next 30 seconds, fast as you can, that you think best describe what the world will look like in 2030. Type them in, we'll get a world cloud going and we'll take a look at what you think. A couple other things I'd say. Does an effective NATO in 2030 need to go beyond governments and include a wider set of actors? I mean, it may take a diverse array of actors beyond states to meet the threat landscape of 2030. Antonio Guterres, my good friend, the Secretary General of the UN, has told me that his top priority is that treaties need to go beyond states. I mean, big multinational corporations in the West can increasingly have all the power over surveillance and data. Don't they need to play a role in an organization like NATO? How could you defend against cyber threats without them? What's the appropriate role for all of them? And finally, what unique contributions can NATO make to addressing transnational challenges such as pandemic disease, climate change, macroeconomic stability? What is NATO equipped to do that other organizations can't or less equipped to do, especially given the alignment that still exists in NATO and increasingly doesn't in lots of other parts of the world? Okay, so I'm looking at what you all have written, and there is a very tough agenda for NATO in place for the next 10 years. Look at this. Fragmented, chaos, divided, uncertainty, polarized, grim. Frankly, multipolar is perhaps the only word that I see here that might be considered a more optimistic, more proactive agenda item for NATO. The rest are a threat environment that is indeed more challenging. What I can say is that that does tell you that the role of NATO is not going to diminish. It's going to be much more important, but also the critical nature of NATO reform is going to grow, and it's going to accelerate as we think through our G0 world and as we move into the world of 2030. I hope you found this useful, and really a pleasure as always working with NATO and working with the Munich Security Conference. I will be seeing you all certainly in Munich in February and hopefully well before then. Be good.
My name is Corey Flesser. I am 35 years old and from the United States. I'm the most passionate about the women, peace, and security agenda. To me, NATO is a complicated transatlantic family. The impact of climate change within fragile regions, and specifically how this exacerbates existing gender, ethnic, and socioeconomic inequity within these areas.
Hi, my name is Güde Jensen. I am 31 years old and I am from Kiel, northern Germany. Securing and defending the rule of law and the basic concept of universal human rights. Hearing from and seeing all these different kinds of perspectives.
Hi, my name is Claudia Maneggia, I'm 29 years old and I'm from Italy. To engaging in productive conversation and seeking other perspectives to challenge my own thoughts. Assurance and expectation that every actor will play his own role.
My name is Connor Hannigan. I am 26 years old. I am Canadian and I'm also a British citizen. NATO matters because it's a forum for building trust and shared understanding. It provides a basis for taking collective decisions. One is capability development, and the other one is digitalization. When you guys say NATO, I say integrity.
And welcome back. Time for our first breakout session now. So in a moment, you'll be able to choose which session you want to join. The topic is going to be a strong military alliance. But before that, we're going to take our third poll question of the afternoon, please. So if we could just get that poll question up on the screen. And unsurprisingly, the question is, how can allies make sure that NATO stays strong militarily? How can allies make sure that NATO stays strong militarily? If you could please put your answers in now. Just give it slightly longer. Again, you have very clear opinions on this. You're quite united in your views, which is interesting. And we are going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And if we could close the poll now, please, and see the results. So 65% of you think that the alliance should focus on the military application of cyber and new technologies. That's quite an overwhelming result again, followed not that closely by option B, which is exercise more together for different scenarios. So some quite interesting thoughts to take away into the next sessions. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, you have the option now of choosing between channels 1, 2, or 3. So the broad theme of this session is a strong military. But if you want to watch Keeping Peace, Contributing to Stability Beyond NATO's Borders, then you can stick with us on channel 1. If you want to watch Ready for the Future and take part in Ready for the Future, Defending NATO in 2030, then go to channel 2. And if you want to take part in Prepared to Respond, NATO and Disruptive Technologies, please go to channel 3. I hope you enjoyed the sessions. I'm now going to hand you over to the moderators for those.
To the Munich Security Conference and to NATO for organizing NATO 2030. To the Munich Security Conference and to NATO. The Youth Summit. For organizing NATO 2030. To the Munich Security Conference. Audio here. Great. I am truly honored to be a part of this event and sit virtually among so many leaders and brilliant minds. First, one bit of housekeeping. There will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A button on the left-hand side of your screen to submit your questions to the speakers, and keep in mind that this function is only available to registered participants. And I will remind you again, as our session gets underway, of how to do that. Our session is entitled Keeping Peace, Contributing to Stability Beyond NATO's Borders. We're here to discuss the role of NATO members in working for stability beyond the borders of the NATO alliance. One goal of NATO, as the audience all knows, is to resolve differences through negotiations and political dialogue rather than armed conflict in order to preserve peace. And that has meant that often, particularly in the last 2 decades, NATO has had to focus outside of its borders. The 21st century has brought world events that have taken members outside the borders of the alliance for the fight against the Taliban in Afghanistan, the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and Russia's increasingly aggressive behavior, including the annexation of Crimea. And for decades, members of the alliance have been working with NATO partners in the Middle East and in North Africa. The questions today are, have their efforts been successful? Do members need to focus more or less on what is going on outside the borders of the alliance? And keep in mind here that NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said, when our neighbors are stable, we are more secure. So we begin our discussion today in Yemen. And as most of you know, democratic rights in Yemen are severely restricted. We have a video statement today from Tawakkol Karman. She is the chairwoman and co-founder of Women Journalists Without Chains. It's an organization that promotes freedom of expression and democratic rights. She's also a 2011 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Here's Tawakkol Karman.
Hello everyone. I hope you are all in good health and spirit. I am happy to be with you at the first NATO Youth Summit. As you see, our world is going through a state of global disorder and conflicts, with decreasing commitment to dialogue and coordination between countries. The escalation of wars and conflict during last years is a reflection of the global failure to respond to the demands of people for freedom, democracy, justice, and rule of law, especially people in Arab Spring countries. The global disorder seems to be reviving old conflicts which threatens global peace, like what is happening now between Azerbaijan and Armenia, between Greece and Turkey. The global disorder is also evident in Syria, for example, where all the contradictions have converged on confronting the Syrians' dream for freedom and democracy. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been leading counter-revolutions, igniting wars, and supporting militias and extremist groups in countries in Arab region that have witnessed popular uprising calling for democracy. In my country, Yemen, there is a war that has been going on for about 6 years. This war has been led by regional parties, namely Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran. Their counter-revolution effort that aim to kill people's dream of creating a new democratic, stable, united Yemen. This war has led Yemen to be the worst and to suffer from the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the UN. This tragedy continues with the absence of serious effort from the international community to stop this devastating war. Here we should call NATO to work very hard and immediately to stop these conflicts and wars around the world, to build peace around the world. Peace building, as we all know, requires attention to the political, cultural, economic, and social elements. For me, the first element that must be ensured for the success of any peace initiative is to impose severe sanctions on warlords and restrictions on those finding their interests in the continuation of armed conflict. I call on NATO to build a peace strategy that includes supporting the demands of people for democracy and for freedom, and refraining from cooperating with the authoritarian regimes. NATO should be with people to combat despotism and terrorism together. This should be our global partnership. Those who align with the tyrannies under any form not only jeopardize values, but also undermine their country's strategic interests and undermine global peace. Finally, to you, the youth of this very important NATO summit. This new century needs new creative generations and new energy like yours. You are today's world hope. You should be today's world leaders. Everything you do, no matter how small or big, will have an impact. Keep up the good fight for a good and noble values. Believe in yourselves and do the right thing. This world is yours. Go out there and make the world a better and safe place. Make the world free from tyranny and terrorism. Make the world free from poverty, hunger, and corruption. And make the world free from hatred and racism. No one can do that but you. I trust you. Thank you so much.
Well, that was terrific. Thank you, Tawakkul Karman. I think it's very clear after hearing that inspirational message to the youth leaders of this NATO summit, it's very clear why the world and Yemen knows her as the Iron Woman. I'd like to bring in our panelists now. We have first Dr. Frances Brown, who is a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. She has also worked at the White House on the National Security Council staff. We have Major General Jenny Carignan of the Canadian Armed Forces, who is the commander of NATO Mission Iraq in Baghdad, which of course is the non-combat advisory and training mission that works primarily with the Iraqi Ministry of Defense and helps build Iraqi institutions, including and strengthening the Iraqi military. And we have Mariam Safi, who is the founder and director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies in Kabul, which elevates women's voices and perspectives to local policymakers and to the international community. Welcome to you all. Dr. Brown, I'd like to start with you. You've written about the need for stabilization in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and beyond. NATO nations have been involved in stabilization and in countering terrorism for years, more than 2 decades now, particularly in Afghanistan and now in Iraq and in Syria. What have the allies, the NATO allies, learned? And will it make it, what they have learned over these 2 decades, do you think that that will make it more or less likely that NATO nations will get involved in conflict areas in the future? Dr. Brown, if you can hear me, I think you might be muted. I'm sorry to interrupt. If you can hear me, I think you might be muted.
I'm so sorry. Is that better?
There we go.
Lessons relearned in NATO and on Zoom are that you should always unmute. So a few thoughts on lessons NATO allies have learned over the past, I'd say, 2 decades. Number one is the importance of connecting large national level politics to local level stabilization efforts. I would say in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we started with a focus on the national level, on Baghdad and Kabul. Then we realized somewhat belatedly the importance of focusing at the local level on stabilization and violent extremism reduction there, pivoted in both cases towards the local level. But then still never really successfully linked up those 2 efforts. So now, many years onwards in Afghanistan, the NATO mission there has sort of turned back to a much more modest footprint, much more national level focus. But we still haven't successfully linked up all the progress that was made on the local level with those national level efforts. So I think that's number one. Number 2 lesson I think we've learned over and over again is that we can make progress on the security side, on the military side, much more quickly than we can on the governance side. And when we think about stabilization agenda for NATO going forward, it really is about linking those 2 efforts together. You may recall the era of clear, hold, build in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, it's always much more quick to clear an area than to link it up with holding and building. So we've learned that going forward. And then the third lesson, just on a very fundamental level, is I think we've learned over and over how hard it is to connect civilian lines of efforts with the military advising, assisting efforts. And although I think all NATO allies sort of work in good faith to connect those up, I think in practice it's often very hard for some bureaucratic reasons. I'll leave it there for now.
Great. I want to follow up on that and stay in Afghanistan for a moment. Ms. Safi, I'd like to ask you about the fight for women's and girls' rights in Afghanistan, something that you have been very outspoken and you're working towards. How can NATO help ensure that women's rights are preserved in a power-sharing agreement with the Afghan government and the Taliban? Is there a role for NATO? Can they actually influence the issue enough that it's not ignored in the inter-Afghan dialogues?
Thank you, Ms. Cube. Great pleasure to be here with you all. I think NATO has great leverage on the negotiating parties in the table. And one of the key leverage is that in the agreement between the United States and the Taliban on a withdrawal of forces, which also includes withdrawal and reduction of NATO forces, there's a key component there that can be stressed upon, and that is to align the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan to key deliverables and conditionalities on the ground. That means it comes to the assurances of maintaining the constitutional rights of Afghan women and the gains that they have made in the last 19 years. Those gains can be now linked to the timeline of withdrawal. So as a condition is met on the ground that secures these interests, then withdrawal can be slowly phased out. And that's a key leverage that the international community holds down.
I'd like to ask, and I just want to update our audience, we're still working to get General Karanyan on the phone. We're having a little bit of connection issues. Not surprising given she's calling in from Baghdad. But I would like to ask a question to the both of you, if I can. We'll start with you, Dr. Brown. Does NATO need to do more to protect civilians in these conflict zones? One area that comes to mind is in northern Syria, where we have this refugee crisis. But beyond just that, should NATO play a larger role in the protection of civilians in conflict areas? And how do you see, if so, how do you see that playing out in various areas? Dr. Brown?
Yeah, to my mind, it's essential that NATO play that role. I'm certainly aware there's many organizational considerations that determine a NATO mission in any given country, but I think when we think about a durable stability, which is what this panel is all about, sort of not just winning the immediate term conflict, but ensuring stability in the long run, ensuring the conditions that don't foment violent extremism in the longer term, I think NATO playing a civilian protection role is key. I do think NATO and specific allied countries have recognized this in recent engagements. And I think there was a lot of thought given to whether specific operations would, quote, create more bad guys than they took off the battlefield. So I think there's been effort in this direction, but I think honestly, in a wartime context, it's often very hard to execute that in real life. But to my mind, this comes back to linking up the civilian lines of efforts with the military ones. And when we think about an enduring battlefield success, really thinking about those civilian considerations on as equal importance to the military operational planning that we do every day.
Ms. Safi?
Yes, I would absolutely concur with Ms. Brown on that. One of the difficulties we faced in Afghanistan with the involvement of NATO was, on the one hand, as we saw the rise in the insurgency, the emergence of the insurgency towards the very initial stages of the international intervention, two things led to that rise. One was the lack of focus on the development front and the securitization of NATO's involvement predominantly under security sector reform. Lacking that development stage on the one hand, and on the other hand, the sort of quasi-state building counterinsurgency efforts, which really wreaked havoc on the population at the subnational level, and it really gave rise to civilian casualties. And as civilian casualties increased, that eroded the legitimacy that NATO intended to develop with other partners between the population and the state, the new state, I must say, at that time, and also between the population and the efforts of the international community. So ensuring the protection of civilians, especially in the counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan, was something that was very severely overlooked for a very long time, and it disenfranchised the local population.
I want to remind the audience again that there's a Q&A button on the left-hand side of your screen to submit questions. We have a couple that have come in. One comes from Daniel in Poland, and he asks, dear panelists, don't you think that tougher USA policies towards Saudi Arabia's actions in the Middle East would bring more stability and peace to the region? Of course, that touches on what we heard from Ms. Karman in her recorded statement about the actions of Saudi Arabia in the region, particularly in Yemen. Dr. Brown and Ms. Safi, I'm curious about your feelings on that. Does the USA need a tougher policy towards Saudi Arabia and their actions in the region?
I can start. In my view, yes. I think when we think about the conflict in Yemen, a key driver of that, a key driver of the casualties does stem from arms. And so I think thinking very clearly about what NATO allied members are doing to exacerbate conflict is super important. And I suspect, not being able to see the future, but I suspect we'll see a reconsideration of that policy now that Vice President Biden has become President-elect Biden. So I would expect there will be some really sober looks at what U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia is affecting in Yemen.
Ms. Safi?
Ms. Cube, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question.
Oh, I'll read it again. It's a question from Daniel in Poland, and he's asking whether a tougher USA policy towards Saudi Arabia's actions in the Middle East would bring more stability to the region. Do you think so? Do you agree with that?
Well, I would say that now with President-elect Joe Biden, perhaps we may see a shift in policy, and I think that this shift in strengthening or toughening its policies could try to bring about a balance amongst the efforts of all the stakeholders in the region. So I would say that this could potentially hold a stability factor, but we will wait and see how that policy transforms.
I think here in the US, we're waiting to see how a lot of policies transform in the next administration. We have another question from Sophie in Germany, who asks, if you think about engaging with civil society on the ground, how do you think NATO should reform the protection and inclusion of young people and children? So we've already spoken about women, specifically women and girls, but what about protections for young people and children? Dr. Brown, could you address that? And Ms. Safi, perhaps you could address it specifically to Afghanistan.
Sure, I can start. So I agree with the premise of the question. It's essential. I can't speak to NATO level guidance on inclusion of youth because I'm not deeply in the weeds on it. But I will say when it comes to the United States and its own measures it takes to include youth, I would say that there have been many disparate efforts on this in various conflict areas. I think the challenge is really going beyond one-time engagement with youth, sort of having a youth meeting, having a youth shura, and actually connecting those engagements to the bigger level politics of the area. So on the US effort in Afghanistan, and I'm interested in Ms. Safi's views on this as well, I think over the course of the so-called surge, so around 2009 to 2013, we did see a lot of efforts to bring in youth on a sort of one-off basis. The problem is that those one-off meetings rarely led to a bigger policy shift from the US. And now I think this is essential as we think about any potential peace bargain in Afghanistan. There is a very robust youth movement in Afghanistan, very diverse. I think bringing in those voices in a really substantive way, rather than just a tokenistic way, will be important going forward. In my view, it's essential. It's helpful when we bring these efforts into the central bargain, the central negotiations. Don't just have a separate meeting on youth, but actually bring them to the table on sort of on the larger conversations. But I'm really curious Mustafi's views on these.
Thank you. I would add to that and state that in failed and post-conflict states, security sector models have to be very careful, not be merely looked as being imposed by external actors, which to a large extent in the very beginning of NATO's intervention in Afghanistan, this is largely what it was and how it was being looked at. However, later on, in the realization that they were losing the hearts and minds of the local population, more commitment was placed to ensure that all sectors, I would say civil society, women, and youth, were engaged more. And I think that NATO so far in Afghanistan has, and platforms that I've been a part of, have created forums where they engage more frequently with different sectors of civil society, particularly with women's groups. However, these meetings are not as consistent or as institutionalized as they should be to ensure that what is being discussed or the voices that are being shared are then actually taken to influence decision makers and policymakers. In that area, there is a lot more work that needs to be done. And I would say even more with youth. I agree with Ms. Brown, we have quite a vibrant youth population. 64% population is below the age of 24. So engaging youth across the country is quite important. That engagement is taking place, but right now it's predominantly at in the city centers and not so much at subnational level. And this is actually instead of coming together. So a lot more efforts needs to be placed there. A lot more platforms need to be created. But more than that, we need to ensure that voices are actually heard and then influenced at a level where that is missing in Afghanistan. And in the recent few years, I would say perhaps in the last 2 to 3 years, I have seen that NATO has actually started to distance its engagement from both civil society organizations and youth. And to an extent, even women's group. So that needs to be re-engaged.
And it's an ongoing battle, truly battle there in Afghanistan. I mean, just only several days ago, there was the horrific attack at Kabul University that killed students and professors. The Taliban is, and insurgents are fighting against the youth population there and against their education. So it is something that is as important as ever for NATO to engage in. I'd love to bring that in. We've only got a few minutes left, but this is the NATO Youth Summit. This is about the future leaders of NATO and a decade out. How do you see let's touch particularly on NATO working with civil society. What advice do you have, or how do you see NATO working with civil society going forward, and particularly where do you see it in 2030? How can NATO be successful with its goals with more engagement with the civil society? Dr. Brown?
There's a couple priorities in my mind. Number one is NATO in 2030, when it thinks about civil society engagement or just efficacy in general, I think it has to really retool for smaller footprint operations. So we probably won't see another NATO mission Afghanistan of that scope, but we will see, I think, many smaller scale operations. So retooling its civil society engagement and indeed its planning in general for those smaller footprint operations. The second thing I think NATO future leaders need to think about is how do we measure progress and define success in stabilization operations? We've done so much over the last 20 years of improving monitoring and evaluation on the ground, but we still can't really answer this fundamental question, which is it working or not? Are we winning or not? And I do think civil society engagement is both part of the answer to how do we know where it's working, and also part of the objective is empowering civil society to have a vibrant role in the host nation government. And then my final thought on this is that I think NATO allies in general still have very distinct ideas of what we're talking about when we talk about stabilization overall. We in the United States government just came up with a common definition of stabilization within the United States government. And then there's many different nuances when you talk with other NATO allies. So I think when we think about succeeding in the NATO of 2030, I think it behooves all NATO young leaders to think about what is our common definition of success and what we're trying to do when we do stabilization. Over.
Coffee?
Yes, can you hear me?
Have I frozen? I may be frozen. If I am, Dr. Safi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Are we done?
Welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed those breakout sessions. Now, as part of this first ever Youth Summit, NATO's decided to organise and launch its first ever youth video contest, because after all, the younger generations are going to be the ones that have to deal with the emerging challenges of the future. We asked people of 18 to 25 years of age to answer 2 of the following questions in the video style, in a video format. These 2 questions are: what will be the most significant threats to peace and security in 2030, and how will NATO need to adapt to counter them? I think that's actually 2 questions in one, really. And then the second question is, how can NATO help to keep me and my family safe both now and in 2030? We received a huge number of entries, but we managed to get them down to a sizable number, and there are 4 worthy winners. And to take you through the process and in the announcement of who's actually won the contest, I'm delighted to hand back over to the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg.
Thank you so much, Laura. It is a great honor and pleasure to announce the winners of NATO 2030 video contest. You sent us many very impressive and thought-provoking entries about the future of our security, and therefore it is an honor to announce the winners. And the winners are... Congratulations to Chiara, Damian, Anvesh and Stella.
My family immigrated to Canada nearly 20 years ago. We felt safe here because this country welcomed us with open arms. We felt safe here because NATO's protection enables an environment conducive to peace, hard work, and economic success. Our very way of life depends on that security guarantee.
Very pleased to inform you that your entry is one of the 4 winners selected.
Congratulations!
Yeah, you deserve it. Yeah, very good.
This is the place where the PRESPA agreement has been celebrated. This natural treasure, whose shores unite 3 NATO allies, Albania, Greece, North Macedonia, is being threatened by a force that may cause a detrimental effect: climate change. So we, the young people, do have a mission of spreading this message loud and clear towards a successful 2030 agenda, all NATO allies together. I would like to thank my brother David and Achilles Rakinas, the Greek consul in my hometown Bitola, for their invaluable help. I promise to continue sharing the message of PRESPA as a unique symbol of unity and a call for action towards NATO 2030. Thank you.
Personal hygiene, once properly integrated, simply becomes a part of a daily routine of good behavior and occasional checkups. However, also cyber hygiene should be viewed in exactly the same manner. It will be important to adapt to the dynamic nature of cyberspace and the threats that come along with it. I think that participation is key for building a community. That's why, to me, participating in this video contest has been of a great significance. Thank you again for choosing my video.
NATO will also have to consider health emergencies, such as the one which the war is facing right now. The Alliance will have to continue to fulfill its collective security tasks. Women can contribute to the maintenance of peace and security of the Alliance, and make NATO more stronger politically. As Executive Vice President of IATA International and IATA Italy, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share this video on our social media channels. NATO 2030 talks about our future and the future of the Alliance, and we must be part of its realization.
NATO has to promote as many common ideas and goals between member states as possible. I also believe in involving the youth.
I think that the biggest threat in 2030 will be cyber attacks, and that they can spy, infiltrate and gather information.
We live in a time where people don't trust their officials, their states, and they are being polarized because of the disinformation, because they don't know what is truth and what is not. And we have to restore that trust to the states and trust between each other.
Information operations, cyber defense, public diplomacy, strategic communications, and combating misinformation will be the Alliance's battlefield and battle space of the future. Cohesion and unity should be preserved and safeguarded by all military and political decision makers by any means necessary.
For instance, the Alliance will have to step up its efforts in the cyber domain, which is becoming increasingly essential, especially regarding security of our infrastructure and public transport. In order to tackle this challenge, the Alliance and its member states should increase cooperation with civil society, international organizations and NGOs.
NATO has to become more united in order to tackle disinformation race challenges. Since every organization worth as much as its member states invest in it, allies have to invest in NATO, not only financially, but politically as well.
Time for our second breakout session of this afternoon. And in a moment, I'll give you the details for the different rooms. The theme will be towards a stronger political alliance, but first we're going to do a quick poll just to get some thoughts and some focus beforehand. So if we could see the poll question, how can NATO become a stronger political alliance? And please vote now, and remember you can vote a maximum of twice, so you can give 2 answers. Please vote now. How can NATO become a stronger political alliance? There's quite a lot of movement going on here, chopping and changing around. Less agreement, clearly. And we will be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So if you could please put the results up. And we can see from here, we'll wait for those last stragglers to finish voting. But I think from our final results, we can see that point A has almost 50%, which is we develop joint answers to global challenges like climate change and pandemics. Also, option B, we maintain our internal unity and solve differences among allies. So those were the 2 top scoring ones, followed by D, we counter threats to democracy such as disinformation. So again, plenty of food for thought as we go into our breakout sessions, parallel sessions, on how to strengthen the political alliance. So if you want to stay on channel 1, what you'll hear or be able to take part in is Under Arms Control, the future of strategic stability in the Euro-Atlantic region. On Channel 2, Heating Up, Climate Change and Global Security. And on Channel 3, Tricking the Trolls, a look at the digital future. Remember, you can always come back to Channel 1 at the end because that's where we'll be picking up for the joint session. I hope you enjoy your sessions, and now I'm going to hand you over to your moderators.
Thank you. I've lost the video of everybody else. I just see myself right now. But I think we've started, so I will get started. Hello and welcome to our session on arms control, where I hope you can see the other panelists. I had all 4 of them, and now I'm only seeing myself, so maybe the production crew can help with that. We are joined today by 3 other guests, and I think a statement from Ben Wallace. Are we getting that first, or do we already have that?
It's a privilege to speak to NATO's future leaders today. Although you've set me a tough challenge to talk about arms control and the future of strategic stability in the Euro-Atlantic region in under 4 minutes, so I'll try my best. In 2 days' time, we will mark Remembrance Day in the United Kingdom and reflect on the Allied efforts to secure freedom from fascism in the Second World War 75 years ago. After the devastating conflict, nations founded post-war institutions like NATO to preserve our international order and protect shared values of freedom, democracy, and justice. The alliance was never about offense, but mutual self-defense, its power resting on deterrence, the ability to convince any aggressor that the price of an attack would be outweighed by the consequences. It worked. For more than 70 years, our nations have enjoyed strategic stability and peace, and NATO's nuclear umbrella, all of which the UK's deterrent formed part, played a pivotal part in persuading others not to build their own nuclear weapons. The West won the Cold War. But even as NATO nations hoped to reap a peace dividend, our adversaries plotted a comeback. Today they are ripping up the rulebook, violating nuclear treaties, militarizing international waters, and developing new novel weapon systems. The likes of Russia stealthily operate below the threshold of traditional alliance response. They are conducting cyber attacks from the shadows, handing weapons to proxies and attempting assassinations with chemical weapons. Meanwhile, North Korea's repeated launches of ballistic missiles and Iran's ongoing destabilizing activity throughout the region raise deep concerns. The old world of static peace and war has been replaced by a new age of constant conflict. NATO still guards our borders and reaches deep across continents, but it must adapt to remain as potent in 2030. So we're asking ourselves some searching questions. How can the alliance provide a credible deterrent in an age of non-traditional warfare? What can it do to prevent an arms free-for-all? And how can future arms control agreements support our security? I don't have all the answers, but security is not a competition, it is a partnership. And history shows us that as long as we work in solidarity, we will maintain the strategic stability on which our peace and prosperity depend.
Well, thank you for that nice message from the British Defense Secretary, and welcome everyone to our panel. I think we're all on now. I can see everybody. We're all good. This is our panel on arms control and strategic stability in the Euro-Atlantic region going forward. We have three wonderful guests here today. We had, let me get this correct. We have Jessica Cox, Director of Nuclear Policy at NATO. Pia Verhoop, Head of the Berlin Office of the Institute for Peace and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. And Heather Williams, Lecturer at King's College London. And I'm Kevin Barron. I'm your moderator. I'm the Executive Editor of Defense One. We are a national security, military, and defense-focused news organization here in Washington. I'm a Pentagon reporter by trade. That's what I've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. And as an editor, I'm frequently moderating at events like these with NATO. And very happy to be back and be able to support this interesting and important event. Happy to pay it forward. We were all young professionals once. I guess I'm not one because I get to moderate now. So I used to be young. Now I'm just a professional. So you have something to aspire to. So let's get right to it. We're not going to do opening statements. We want to get questions through the audience as soon as we can. But just to help lay the land of where arms control is, you can read about a lot about this at Defense One and lots of other places. And maybe some of you know a lot of what's going on. I know on the tip of a lot of people's tongues is what's on the calendar. New START expiring soon. And a new president in the United States, a president-elect, unless you're one of the few holdouts in America hoping for a different outcome when the votes are really all the way counted. It looks like President-elect Joe Biden will be here, which is important for arms control because it has to do with whether or not New START survives in any form going forward. There are other issues as well on the table, but Jessica Cox, please start us off with kind of telling everyone what's the most important issues on the agenda at NATO right now that is occupying your time, and where we should all be looking in the especially the near future and the next coming months of what to expect.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to Munich Security Conference and NATO for having me. And I want to just start off by saying, I think we're all very excited about the Biden administration and what they are going to do on New START. Biden has been very clear as a candidate that he supports New START extension, which is, of course, the position of most, if not all, of the allies here at NATO. So we are hopeful that the talks between the current administration and Russia can continue during the transition period, and that the treaty can be extended in February or before February when it's set to expire. That said, New START isn't kind of the panacea for all of our problems at NATO. Russia has been undergoing a strategic and non-strategic military buildup, particularly with its nuclear arsenal over the past decade. And that is most kind of notably and recently seen with its intermediate range cruise missiles that it developed and deployed in violation of the INF Treaty, which caused the end of that treaty in late or mid last year. But we're also seeing Russia develop and deploy capabilities such as hypersonic missile systems, such as a wide of air, sea, and ground-launched missile systems. So the threat picture doesn't stop with New START and maintaining the strategic balance. We also have to look at the balance below the strategic level. So let me stop there and look forward to the rest of the questions.
Let me then perhaps, well, we'll begin as good on the line, and I can ask Heather if you want to pick up on what you heard or add a different element to the topic, to the conversations to start. Heather, can you hear us? I know she's on a little delay.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming in great.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So I really want to, I think, foot stomp what Jessica said, which is that New START is not the end all be all here. Obviously it should be the priority because it is a rapidly approaching deadline that we need to be aware of. But this conference is about NATO in 2030. So I just quickly want to kind of point to some issues that we can start thinking about with arms control over the next decade. And if we do think about this, arms control doesn't happen in a vacuum. Right? It has to be tied to geopolitics. So the arms control that we evolve over the next decade really depends on what happens with geopolitics over the next decade, particularly identifying areas of common interest. And I do think there is a common interest within the Euro-Atlantic region to strengthen strategic stability. And just really quickly, we can think of strategic stability as arms race stability and crisis stability. And based on the polling that I saw earlier on this conference, there seems to be a lot of consensus among NATO youth about the potential impact of cyber and other emerging technologies. So we have to start thinking about how those technologies are going to impact on crises and arms racing. But I do always try to be an arms control optimist. And so to get the conversation going, I wanted to highlight 3 areas where I think we might be able to be optimistic about arms control and questions for people to start considering. First, a lot of these emerging technologies, they're really costly. They're going to be expensive. To pick up on Ian Bremer's question, what will the global economy look like in 2030? And will investment priorities shift from defense to other issues? Second, we're seeing new leadership in arms control, particularly in Europe. The German Foreign Ministry hosted a great conference last week on this topic. So what role can Europeans play in arms control? And then lastly, with the election of President-elect Biden, I get the sense of increasing optimism about arms control, which is great. But what do Europeans and America's European allies want to see for the future of arms control as well? Is it multilateral? Is it a continuation of US-Russia bilateral? Is it all of the above and something else? And so I'll leave it there, but thank you to the organizers. Again, this is a great opportunity and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. We'll get to all those points. Pia, up to you as well. You had said earlier you in your message that you wanted to get to finer points, maybe for especially this audience. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and also thank you to the organizers for having me. I will try and also pick up on what Heather said, and I think it's correct that arms control and geopolitics interrelate. But I think it's really important for this session to keep in mind that arms control is not a dependent variable. It can independently affect geopolitics. And I think sort of if I were to say, what do I wish for the alliance to do in the next 10 years or to be in the next 10 years, then I think it's to be a bit more enthusiastic and more active and more concrete on arms control. And I think for all the reasons Heather has described and Jessica has described, there has been a lot of emphasis on deterrence. But I think in thinking about NATO's future, the US as well as European allies really have to sort of be a bit more proactive on what it is that they want to achieve in arms control.
Good points, all as well. I'm reading some of the questions that have come in from the viewers, from the participants in the Youth Summit, and I remind everyone to please send those in. I think I forgot to mention the instructions ahead of time, but I think the viewers know by now how to do that. Again, if you're a general public viewer, you don't have the ability to ask questions, but if you're a registered member of the summit, you can. And I'll get to that real quickly. I want to just ask all of you, like I said in the beginning, New START is the big story as a journalist that we're all looking toward right now. But last year it was INF. And one of the worries of INF was when it expired, so did any protections that were there to prevent Russia from having or obtaining or changing the arsenals that the kinds of missiles specifically that threaten Europe. That's a different threat than the United States. So here in the United States, doesn't get as much attention, not as much worry or concern as ICBMs, as the old Cold War era agreements. But when I spoke to Jens Stoltenberg last year, he made it kind of clear that he remembers growing up under the nuclear umbrella, then under the protection of the INF Treaty. It's real there. So have we seen any changes or anything to worry about since the INF Treaty ended with those types of missiles? You mentioned hypersonics, and there are possible cruise missiles, other types of tactical nuclear weapons, and the difference between that threat that was created by the expiration of, or the two parties pulling out of that treaty, versus what we're worried about with New START. Maybe Jessica could answer some of that to start. Yeah.
Sure, I can certainly jump in. I think in general, NATO allies were very disappointed at the end of the INF Treaty because, as you say, it has been a key pillar of Euro-Atlantic security for 20, 30 years now. But the truth of the matter is Russia was developing and deploying a range of intermediate range missiles that were not covered treaty, in addition to violating the treaty and covering by producing and deploying missiles that were in violation. So it wasn't really benefiting NATO anymore. And when we tried to engage Russia, both from a US standpoint, and I had the opportunity to participate as a US government official before joining NATO on our discussions with the Russians on INF, but also once I came to NATO and we tried to engage Russia directly, it was very clear that Russia had no intention of coming back into compliance with the treaty. So I think, it's unfortunate because it has left Europe a little bit vulnerable to these systems. And so, as Pia mentioned before, we have been looking at how we mitigate the risks that are now posed by Russia's missile systems. And NATO's really spent the last 2 years looking at ways that we can not only strengthen the resiliency and survivability of our nuclear systems in response to Russia's violation and its missile developments, but also look at ways we can enhance our defensive capabilities, ways that we can potentially invest more in conventional capabilities as well to make sure that Russia doesn't gain an advantage in the Euro-Atlantic region. So that is a lot of what NATO has been looking at. We've also been looking at arms control and what new arms control mechanisms we could potentially develop that would strengthen both existing regimes that cover missiles like the MTCR, but also trying to develop new ideas to enhance the stability of the region. The problem that we face is that NATO as an organization is not party to any arms control, and we wouldn't negotiate. So it's really based on what our member countries with the capabilities and the technologies will negotiate in coordination with the whole alliance. And that's an ongoing work in progress right now.
Yeah, let me put it to our other two panelists, but also I'll add it to the question that's come in from the viewers because it's on the same thread. What I'm thinking when I hear your answer is the answer for this kind of arms control more agreements, or is it deterrent capabilities that the members need to build up? And the top question that everyone's getting the most thumbs up on is from Elise Carreau from France, who says, does NATO's deterrent strategy depend too heavily on the military power of the United States? what would the future of NATO look like without a strong U.S. support? Let's focus on the first part of that question. NATO deterrent strategy, does it depend too heavily on the military power of the United States? Again, how much is this? Do we need a military response as an answer versus what arms control can do? Pia or Heather?
Maybe I'll take the arms control part, if I may, Heather. I think you're way better suited to speak to the what do we do if the United States leaves us part. And I really think sort of it's important to remember when we talk about INF that there is a proposal by the Russians on a moratorium for non-deployment, and I think so far the alliance has answered in saying this is not a reliable proposal. It's one that sort of, gives Russia the benefit for cheating in the INF. And I think sort of that perfectly captures, this answer perfectly sort of captures the dilemma. I think it's fair to be mistrusting Russia, but I think it's also important for the alliance to take up these proposals and really put to a test the seriousness of Russia's attempts to restart arms control. So I think really for the alliance, it always has been a balancing act between deterrence and arms control. And I think it's very clear, or to me at least, it's becoming clearer what the deterrence side is, and it's a lot less clear what the arms control side is. Would the alliance be willing to think about proposals like central storage for certain missiles and launchers and make sure that we at least get into a conversation, even if we don't solve it at this point?
Yes, Heather?
Thanks, and sorry again about the delay. Just two points to really reinforce what Pia said. Deterrence and arms control, they're not mutually exclusive, right? In a lot of ways, they're self-reinforcing. They work in tandem together. And that that goes back in NATO's history to the Harmel Report, and it's really at the core of the alliance. And so I think it can be dangerous if we start thinking of these ideas as in competition or mutually exclusive, but really thinking about how they work together, which I think both Jessica and Pia captured. And then to this question about, what to do if the U.S. draws down its military power, its military presence. For the incoming Biden administration, Biden has said repeatedly that he is deeply committed to NATO and to the allies. I think a direct quote was something along the lines of NATO is the most important military alliance in history. So I can understand with the previous administration where these concerns come from. With the incoming one, I think that we can be pretty confident that the new president is going to be deeply committed to this alliance and to the allies. But I can understand the longer term concern here. What if there's another change of administration? And so I think that requires a lot more long-term planning on NATO's part and consideration by the allies. As Jessica said, this is up to the members, really. And so if the membership as a whole decides that in that balance, in how they look at arms control and military commitments, that's really something for the allies as a whole to decide. If there is a deep concern about U.S. commitment, then I would think that would prompt more of a discussion about burden sharing. I know everyone's sick of talking about burden sharing, but it does predate President Trump. And it's interesting to hear that was the most popular question among in the chat. I can't see it, but if that was, then that makes me ask, well, then do the other members want to start investing and committing more, or are there some other ways to hedge or rebalance against concerns about U.S. long-term commitment?
Yeah. First off, Heather, let us get through this one election before we get to the next one, please. I'm exhausted. We'll focus on this administration. That was the lead question. And to be fair, the question it didn't say anything about should the U.S. pull out or withdraw resources. It was just saying, are there ways that are not as reliant as the U.S. military, which of course has been a theme for the last 4 years, and lots of us who watch NATO don't think that's going to change, just because of the U.S. presidency has changed. The other questions below it are all, or a few of them, I'll combine into one from, let's see, Leonard Freud, Cameron Vasca, pardon if that's the correct pronunciation of your name. Luca, Inyak, all of these are about what role NATO can have in facilitating arms control agreements. Can they have more of a role? Should they assume more of a role? Jessica, you kind of mentioned that earlier, that NATO doesn't do the direct negotiations for countries. So what role does NATO play in that dichotomy?
So I certainly can speak to the role that NATO has played in the past, and I think what we're trying to do is figure out what the role will be in the future. And I should note that I am not the lead on the arms control issues for NATO. There's another director who's committed full-time to doing arms control. But a lot of what NATO has done in the past is be a forum for coordination amongst the allies, for developing proposals that are complementary to NATO's deterrence strategy, as Heather mentioned, the Harmel report, and NATO's dual track decision that predated presage of the INF treaty. But I think even more important than all of that is just the role that NATO plays in bringing ideas to the fore, allowing allies to have a place to work out issues amongst the allies first, before proposals are floated with other countries or potential adversaries in this case, and make sure that whatever is done and developed is in the security interest of all allies. And that's really important because our alliance, while grounded and rooted in a common geography, has very different security interests across the alliance. I mean, our German allies have a very different view of the world than our Romanian allies, than our Spanish allies. And we have to remember that different allies have different priorities and different security needs, which is why NATO can play this really important role of making sure that all allies are heard and all allies are supportive of our initiatives and ideas that are being put on the table. So I think that consultative nature of NATO is really important. And then the second role, which I think is one that really came to the fore through the INF discussions with Russia, was the role that NATO plays in sending a unified message. Allies were very unified in the messages that it sent to Russia throughout the INF process. Support for the United States, acknowledgement that Russia's developing missile system was in violation of the treaty and that it would not be accepted. And so I think that is another role that NATO plays, is putting up a united front, saying this is the right thing to do, and using the alliance as a whole to create negotiating pressure and bringing our negotiating partners to the table.
Good, thank you. And so we're in our last 5 minutes now, just starting. Boy, this goes quick. And we have questions about cyber, about China, and I want to make sure we get a word in about the nuclear ban treaty that was also on our list. So let's do China first, and if we all maybe shorten some answers, or if you have something else you want to say, feel free to chime in. We'll use our time aggressively, call it a lightning round. Britta Jacob from Germany, her question is, how could China be integrated in a serious and credible disarmament initiative? And what would NATO states have to offer in order to achieve this goal? Who wants to tackle that?
I can try.
Everyone all at once. Come on, Pia.
I'll try. So I think there are three things to keep in mind. First, I think bringing China in will be important because it's so important to the United States. Still, bringing China in is no excuse for the necessary developments that have to take place between the US and Russia. And I think one of the things that European allies need to make sure is drive home that message, that the two countries with sort of the biggest nuclear arsenal are the ones who need to take necessary steps. And I think the last thing that always comes to my mind when we talk about China is that to bring China in will require us to be a bit more creative in arms control. These are very asymmetric capabilities, and it will not be the usual counting we're used to. And so maybe even just for that reason, we should try to do it because there's a need for more creativity when it comes to thinking about future arrangements.
That goes, Heather, I thought you may have nodded into that, but the next question may help with any other answers, and that's what are the prospects for arms control around technologies like cyber, especially when NATO allies have different varying positions on the offensive uses of cyber. That question's from Danielle, Danielle Murad Weiss, if I got that right, from Canada. So cyber's in the mix too, but what are your reactions there?
Sure. Just a really quick comment on China first, and then I'll say something on cyber and other technologies. So just on China, I think that we need to think about China arms control as a long-term project, right? We have to think about how to socialize China into arms control practices and principles. This is particularly important around verification. The US and Russia have decades of experience working on these issues together. It's not just the technical factors, it's also just the practice of being more transparent. So I really do think that we have to take a longer term vision about bringing China in. On emerging technologies, just really briefly, I'm guilty of this as much as everybody, but we have to be more specific when we talk about emerging technologies, but particularly about their applications. If we want to talk about all cyber arms control, that's simply too big of a project. We really have to start thinking and isolating down into what are the biggest risks, particularly as it relates to nuclear weapons. And just to, for a second, really plug great work being done by Marina Favreau at BASIC and also at King's College London. Her work is trying to isolate this, but I know others are doing the same. If we can think more specifically, for example, what are cyber threats to nuclear command and control? Well, how could AI be incorporated and increase crisis and stability? We have to get really specific into those applications and then tailor arms control accordingly, I think.
Jessica, on cyber, we've covered at Defense One the evolution of NATO into the world of cyber and cybersecurity. How does that equate to or relate to, when we think of traditional arms control? Or nuclear weapons? I mean, it's all related.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I would just echo what Heather said, which is we have to look at specifics and not just categories. And I think from a nuclear standpoint, what we think about in terms of cyber is both the opportunities and the challenges that it poses. So, for instance, obviously from a nuclear perspective, we are very worried about cyber intrusions into our nuclear command and control infrastructure. This is something that both the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review discussed, and also the new Russian nuclear doctrine alluded to this as well. So we have to think about the potential implications of non-kinetic attacks on our command and control in particular, but our nuclear infrastructure more broadly. And at NATO, we look at this very closely, and we're taking a lot of steps to modernize these types of systems and look at potential vulnerabilities. But I think we also have opportunities as well to think about how we can better use cyber in arms control and in arms control regimes in particular. When you think of the type of verification and monitoring and inspections that we would need for any kind of arms control agreement with China, say, if you have procedures that are less intrusive, China might be more willing to do them. And the way you would do that is using cyber tools, using overhead imagery, commercially available imagery, using some of these emerging technologies in ways that allows for the same types of verification and gives us similar confidence in our systems, but uses new technologies in new and creative ways. And I know many people are thinking about this, but I think that this is where the arms control community needs to move, is getting out of kind of the boots on the ground approach and thinking more about the tools that we have that can take us into the future.
Well,
Alice Biangalin. I'm 28, French. NATO is a unique space for daily dialogue and collective thinking between Europeans and North Americans. The lack of transatlantic and European unity at a time when the security environment is deteriorating.
My name is Mark Steinberg and I'm 35 years old. I'm Latvian. NATO means stability and security in an ever-changing international environment. A misuse of emerging and disruptive technologies will remain as a challenge in years to come.
My name is Ulrich. I'm 32 years old. I'm a Danish national living in Copenhagen, previously living in Brussels. Living in peace at home for my friends in the Baltics and for my future children. I feel excited, but I also feel humble because we can't do this alone. And there are a lot of young people out there and we need to hear them too, because one day we might need each other.
My name is Dylan White. I'm 32. I'm proud to be Canadian. I hope to be doing fulfilling international work and enjoying it as much as I do now. Great power competition, climate change, and disinformation. Air policing. NATO jets keep European skies safe 24/7. One of my first trips on the job. Pretty cool.
Well, welcome back, and I hope you've all enjoyed the previous discussions. We're now moving into the third sequence of tonight, and of course there are three aspects to the 2030 strategy. We've worked through two of them already. Strong military, stronger politically, and now we're going into more global. And before we go into those breakout sessions, we have time for one more poll question. So if we could see the poll question up on the screen, it is as follows. Who will be the most important partners for NATO in 2030? Who will be the most important NATO partners in 2030? Remember, you can vote twice. Please vote now. Again, very clear consensus emerging for this one. And we will be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 seconds. So if we could close the poll, please. Just wait for our final results. And I think we can see that the EU and other regional international organizations, so option E, is by far the most popular one on 53%. So over half of you went for that choice. Followed by like-minded democracies who share our values, which was option C at 38%. And then the closest after that was option F, countries in strategic parts of the world, such as the Asia-Pacific region. And the UN and the other global international organizations actually got the least. So that's quite an interesting breakdown of responses there. So you can take those findings away into your next sessions, and I'm sure your moderators will be happy to reflect on them with you. I'm just going to give you the information about where you can go for your different sessions now. Stay on this channel if you want to watch a strategic balancing act, NATO in an era of great power competition. Switch to Channel 2 if you want to watch Of Black Swans and Grey Rhinos, enhancing NATO's resilience to future crises. And switch to Channel 3 for Partnering for Peace, NATO's role in the rules-based multilateral order. And please remember to always come back to Channel 1 at the end of your sessions. I hope you enjoy them.
Hello and a very good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us, making the right choice to join us here in Channel 1. I'm Shashank Joshi. I am the defense editor of The Economist, and I have an excellent panel here with me to discuss the subject of NATO in an era of great power competition. I just want to frame this discussion very, very briefly by saying a few words. To me, great power competition means two broad things. First of all, it indicates the way in which defense ministries, armed forces, and of course, governments more broadly have reoriented themselves over the past couple of years away from the non-state challenges of the post-2001 era towards what we sometimes call near-peer competitors, big countries, big rivals, systemic rivals. The other aspect of it is, and I think this is very important, the emphasis on competition. It's great power competition, not great power conflict. And I think this challenges countries, armed forces and alliances that for a long time have thought about either clear thresholds between peace and conflict, and in NATO's case have thought very, very hard about deterrence, deterring conflict, in NATO's case, very rigorously over the past 4 years particularly, perhaps less so about peacetime competition and how that competition can be intense in scale, in scope, in the variety of means in which big powers are competing, and in challenging our traditional ideas that there is a sort of deterrence is what you do in peacetime and conflict is what you do in wartime. So I hope we say a little bit about both of those dynamics. China looms very large on the first part of that, but I think it isn't just about China, it's also about the way in which competition unfolds in a way that is different to the way it's occurred in the past 10 or 15 years. So with that, let me go over to our fantastic panel. We'll begin with Alice Ekman. Alice is an Asia analyst at the European Union Institute of Strategic Studies, EUISS. Alice, please do kick us off. Hear you very well.
Great. So I would like to go back to your comment because we tend to indeed agree that great power competition has shifted from traditional competition between states to non-traditional competition between different international actors, including big companies, including diversity of non-state actors. But actually, I would like to go back to this because more than ever, I think state competition is at the center, is really structuring the current global balance of power. And as a China analyst, I would like to underline why, in my opinion, the rise of China brings a set of challenges that are directly of relevance to both the EU and NATO. What are the challenges related to the rise of China, in my opinion? First and foremost, clearly, it's a structural challenge. By structural challenge, I mean the fact that China is openly against the alliance, the concept of the alliance, and the alliance system itself. China doesn't, under Xi Jinping, since its arrival to power at the end of 2012, China doesn't want to build an alternative alliance system. It wants to promote a more flexible circle of friends, according to Xi Jinping's own word, something more flexible, a flexible type of partnership that will step by step indirectly erode the alliance system, existing alliance system, of course, including NATO allies. By this, I'm pretty confident to say this because it's said black and white in various official documents, and also because Chinese think tanks themselves say that alliance is, I would say, it's a backward, it's outdated concept, it's a burden, it's rigid and it's not suitable to the current geostrategic context, etc., etc. So first and foremost, we have this structural challenge because why concretely China is challenging the five-alliance system because China more and more is proposing initiatives. As you know, the Belt and Road Initiative since 2013, then the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, in 2014, then the Belt and Road Forum that is held biannually since 2017, etc., etc. And these initiatives are proposed to a diversity of countries, including allies. So it creates transatlantic tension among allies about who is part of this initiative, who is not, will you join or not. And now more than ever, you have tension around technology, including what you know, first and foremost, 5G. So first of all, you have a structural challenge. Now more than ever is emerging a technological challenge. We talk a lot about 5G, but 5G is just the tip of the iceberg. At a time of tech decoupling, and I really think that we entered a period of technological decoupling with the US being concerned about the diversity of Chinese technologies and publishing an entity list, listing these entities considering that are posing security concern. But at the same time, MOFCOM, Ministry of Commerce of China, replying with own list of entities, including US entities that it considered unreliable. So there is a tit-for-tat dynamic now that is emerging, and it's not just about 5G, it's about data center, it's about submarine cable, it's about blockchain, it's about surveillance cameras, it's about the whole smart city ecosystem. And I would like to emphasize on the word ecosystem because more than ever, China considered that it has now to innovate, invest in R&D, so that it should be less dependent on foreign technologies and first and foremost US technologies. Not only to be able to be more autonomous, but to be able to promote fully compatible, interoperable technological ecosystem to third market, including Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, etc., etc. And a two type of ecosystem or bipolarization of the tech environment is currently emerging. And I must say, independently of the result of the US election, and independently of the result of the next US election in 2024, Xi Jinping will likely still be in place and really looking long-term at a full tech decoupling. I'm pretty confident in saying this, and this is posing a certain number of challenges to the EU as well as to NATO allies. I won't be too long, but I just want to underline briefly two other type of challenges. One is political challenge. We have seen at time of COVID that there is a battle of narrative that's going on. The previous session was widely talking about this. And really, it's more than just public diplomacy or propaganda. It's about competition between political system, between economic governance. And China, the Xi Jinping, is confident that it should promote its own political and economic governance model far beyond its territory, and is very keen to underline the weaknesses of Europe, of the US, and will continue to do so in the coming years. So the ideological dimension that we were noticing during the Cold War is coming back and will remain independently again of the result of the US election that we know now. But already in 2013, Xi Jinping was talking about this competition between political systems, explicitly mentioning that according to him, socialism is superior to capitalism. Whatever the label whatever the definition we put behind this word, there is, as framed by the Chinese official discourse, already a competition between political system that is extremely tense and that is waiting on all type of crisis and international event. And the last challenge is the economic challenge that is resulting from COVID-19. Now, the real question in the present context is comparative recovery of global powers at a time of pandemic and post-pandemic period. China seems to recover now, step by step. Of course, there is a large part of public diplomacy and propaganda around it, but already now, I mean, you have business that are opening again, you have figures that are rather positive, and this will lead China to consolidate in comparative perspective its rank as the second largest economy in the world, with the hope to become the first largest economy in the world before 2035. This leads to a
can we wrap up in a second?
Sure. All this to wrap up to say that the technological challenge that I mentioned first is serious, because if supported by significant economic capabilities, and if China recover more quickly than Europe or the US, the balance of power will shift, and we should not underestimate the rapprochement between China and Russia that is waiting certainly in this balance of power today.
Thank you so much. That's enormous food for thought there. I expect more than we can digest in the time allotted to us. Amrita Narlikar is the head of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. Amrita, a very warm welcome. Please continue that conversation forwards and take us in the direction you'd like to head in.
Okay, thank you very much, Shashank, for getting us off to a great start, and great to have the inputs from Alice. I want to pick up on the point that Shashank made on competition and conflict. And one of the things that regulated competition and conflict in the last 70 years or so, post-World War, was multilateral institutions. And NATO happens to be one such multilateral institution. And so I want to pick up on what the problems of multilateralism are. Why is the rules-based order under threat? Where are the threats coming from? And how does NATO fit in? So multilateralism has had problems pre-Trump, as we all know. And history, if written with due diligence, will not judge multilateral institutions, most multilateral institutions, kindly for their dealing with at least the first months of the pandemic. This is true for the World Health Organization, this is true for the World Trade Organization, and so forth. And the problem that multilateralism, that rules-based system that had served us well for so long, for several decades, the problems that this rules-based system faces are threefold. First, multilateral institutions were just not built for a world where those very ties that were meant to bind countries together into prosperity and thereby peace could be weaponized. And the assumption was that through increasing trade, we would get more socialization. And today, it is clear that this is not the case. And as the pandemic has shown us, countries are willing to weaponize global value chains, even health chains, sometimes with life and death consequences. The second problem that multilateral institutions face today, and that rules-based order that they're supposed to uphold, is of narrative, something that Alice also mentioned. And the problem here is that all those of us who support multilateralism just haven't done a very good job in explaining to people why multilateralism matters, why it matters to them. We live in this very comfortable Brussels bubble, Geneva bubble, New York bubble of international organizations. And so other types of narratives, populist narratives, the WTO is the worst deal ever made type of narrative did have greater resonance in contrast to the technocratic ones. And the last problem is that multilateralism seems to have lost its purpose, because many of us who talk about multilateralism speak about it as a good in itself. But multilateralism is just an instrument, right? And we need to have a cold, hard think on what are these multilateral institutions for if we want them to function well. And this is where NATO gets interesting. Because if we're going to talk about, for example, trade, and who do we want to have deep integration with, we probably want to have deep integration with countries with which we share some values, countries that we can trust. And NATO is one of the few multilateral institutions that has acknowledged the changes to the geopolitical, in fact, the geo-economic landscape, by recognizing the importance of having solid narratives to counter misinformation, by recognizing that the major power shift that is underway with the rise of China, a country that does not share its values of many of the members, of many of the allies, and NATO has been calling for global partnerships with like-minded countries to work together. And I think I'll stop there, Shashank, but I'm very happy to go into this further later on in the discussion.
Thank you. Joshua Walker is president and CEO of the Japan Society. Joshua, you're in a position to perhaps pull our attention to Asia Pacific more tangibly. It does occur to me, listening to Amrita speak, of course, as well, that when we talk about NATO as a multilateral institution, it's a kind of multilateral security institution that many of those like-minded countries in Asia would bite their own arm off to have, and have, and for various historical reasons have not had. But how do you see their position relative to NATO as China looms large to Europeans, and as some of those ties sort of some of the issues that we're discussing, cybersecurity, space security, information security, become less geographically bounded and therefore perhaps less rooted in Europe?
Well, thank you, and thank you for all joining this conversation. We certainly can't discuss all of this, and I hope it's just the beginning of a much larger conversation that needs to happen. I think that the main point you just raised, and my fellow panelists also raised, is the decreasing importance of geography. You know, even the fact that NATO is now outside of the North Atlantic space is a significant here. I think in some ways the transatlantic century has given way to a trans-Pacific century. The largest economies, the largest populations, the largest security concerns are increasingly in the Asia Pacific. And so when you talk about great power competition and where NATO can have a bigger role, I think you're absolutely right in asking the question, where's NATO going to be and what the traditional allies in Europe. They're not our traditional partners that define World War II. It's what's going to define the next 75 years. And I think COVID in some ways has sped that process up. And so when I think about a country like Japan, the third largest economy in the world, that has a lot of connectivity and connections to the United States and to Europe, and when I think about India, the largest democracy in the world, when I think about Australia, these are the areas we need to be thinking about, because if we are going to have a competition with China or Russia, it can't simply be focused on the North Atlantic space anymore. It needs to focus in the Pacific, and particularly some of the points that Alice and Amrita brought up about how do we make the case for multilateralism? How do we think about competition beyond the security realm? Of course, this is a security alliance, but security is becoming more gray. Where does geotechnology and cyber fit? Economic security, how do these pieces come together? And it's not just big alliances or big countries, it's also public companies. In America, for example, a lot of our cybersecurity infrastructure is not by the Pentagon, it's by GAFA, the Googles, the Apples, the Facebook. You saw the enormous outsized influence that these companies had, private companies had, on the US election process. How do we as democracies deal with that? There's not one size fits all, the way the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese deal with this. We have to learn from each other. And so I believe that rather than thinking about this as kind of how do we just continue the system on and make it relevant, we've got to adapt. We need to think about major change, as we've been talking about throughout this entire conference. But I would simply submit to you that we have to think outside of operations. It's not just about Afghanistan. It's not just about what can the alliance do in specific security areas, but in much broader areas of cooperation. And NATO is doing that. When I think about NATO and Japan cooperation, when I think about Indo-Pacific areas of operation, there is a lot more, there's a lot more to be done, and we're just at the beginning of that.
Joshua, thank you very much. Can I pull that conversation therefore back to Alice? And we've had a question about from Jose Maria Gonzalez in Mexico asking, should NATO focus more on partnerships with like-minded countries in the Asia-Pacific region? What I'd like to ask you is, specifically, are there any types of collaboration or cooperation that you think are going to be particularly productive or useful? I mean, partnership is a very generic idea, and in theory, no one can be against partnership with these countries. I just wonder if you have any sort of ways to make that more tangible. What areas do you think are most promising here for NATO to explore?
Sure. First of all, I think partnership is a good word to use because we are moving towards a more flexible type of alliance system that take different form, different format. We could talk about the Quad. We could talk about ASEAN Plus format. We could talk about different dialogues such as Shangri-La dialogue, etc., etc. So, looking at partnership in different formats from very flexible ways and trying to build bridges between agendas of various initiatives and priorities is already key, because at the same time you have China, who is investing in security governance in the region and beyond, in partnership with Russia. We could talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we could talk about the diversity of forums existing in the region, where some issues are on the agenda and some are not. And more than ever, institutional building is important. So there is, first of all, a global governance dimension to this dynamic. But most of all, I see two areas of cooperation among partners. First of all, technological sphere. Of course, we mentioned it before, but more than ever, it is key to look far beyond 5G, to think about interoperability between different technological services and products, but also talking about norms and standards. Because as you know, technology is not just about civil use, there is also potential military use to many technologies that are currently under competition shaped by different state proposals. And the second, I think, area of cooperation that is very important, it's a cooperation on concept and definition. And it's not just an academic debate. What is responsibility to protect? What is human rights? What is regime change? And because all these keywords are now redefined by China and Russia in key international security architecture, because they're unhappy with this concept and hopes that they can mean different things, so to counter attack on the criticism that they're facing under this concept. So if we don't commonly agree on the definition of the words we are commonly using and sharing in international environment, then why are we becoming like-minded? Why are we like-minded if we don't have shared common definition? That's very key. And beyond like-minded partners, I think it's very important to reach out to other type of countries. Actually, I don't really like this like-minded terms because, you know, in this great power competition, you have a very active China that is talking about enlarging its circle of friends, meaning it's a very accountant-based diplomacy, reaching out to any state possible. It's important to have a long list of states, because sometimes even a state that doesn't weigh much in terms of military capabilities or economic weight still have a vote in a key international organization and within the UN system. So in that competition, accountant-based, I would say, competition between partnerships, circle of friends, alliances, etc., it's important not to neglect countries towards which we cannot say really like-minded. And I think it's important to have this in mind, also on the technological front, to propose ecosystem, including urban smart city ecosystem, to countries who are not like-minded partners, including partnering between, for example, European countries and Asian countries who are like-minded countries, to develop projects in third countries who are not like-minded countries per se.
Thanks. Amrita, can I turn to you? There's a question from Tinatin Japaridze about whether NATO members and allies should be concerned about growing Sino-Russian cooperation. And the question is about the digital domain, but I think it applies more widely. And the reason I wanted to ask you is because, as someone who thinks about world order questions quite a lot and multilateralism, and what is your sense broadly of the degree of alignment in Russian and Chinese positions on security issues, and is it of a degree and a kind that you think is becoming a serious issue for NATO as a European-based alliance?
Thank you very much, Shashank. Tough questions. Also, thanks to the person who sent in this excellent question. Shashank, I would also like to pick up very briefly on what Alice was talking about, like-minded, if I may.
Yeah.
Because I actually think the term like-minded is very helpful. And and NATO, in the NATO discussion, we're going beyond, considerably beyond the discussion that we have in many other international organizations. Because when you talk about values, in the case, for example, of the WTO, you immediately go in the direction of labor standards and environmental standards, which is quite narrow. And when we're talking about like-minded partnerships here and the kinds of countries, the names that have come up, it sounds more like countries that share macro level values, which deal with democracy and liberalism and pluralism and freedom of the press and rule of law and so forth. Having said that, I think it's also very important that if we look for like-minded allies, if NATO looks for like-minded allies, partners, not allies, but partners, we have to get out of that old rut that we were in, which was always the West defines liberalism. No, there are countries, there's Japan, there's India, there are several other countries in Asia which have powerful traditions of liberalism, of pluralism, and so forth, right? So it's about treating these partners more eye to eye. And now picking up on that excellent point on Russia and China, here, how far gone is the link, is the closeness between Russia and China? And I think NATO could play a really important part here, because it is a tough balancing act. You speak to Indian negotiators and practitioners, as I know you do, Shashank, but there the message is very clear, which is that with your sanctions, Europe, you drove Russia into the arms of China, right? Now, of course, all that Russia has done cannot be condoned either, but NATO could play an important role potentially of walking that balance and ensuring that not the entire global South is driven into the arms of China, and Russia, which is an important balancer, is not driven into the arms of China.
Amrita, thank you so much. And we only have a couple of minutes left, I think. So, Josh, if I could turn to you finally, just to wrap us up, perhaps very, very briefly. As someone who thinks a lot about Japan, knows a great deal about Japan and the security environment that it's in, I just wonder if you could, if you were sort of looking at lessons from that country's own emerging competition with China over the last several years and neighboring countries as well, what lessons would you offer NATO from that experience? Does anything jump out at you?
Yeah, the first thing that jumps out at me is poking the dragon is dangerous. Taking your finger and sticking it in the eye for the sake of doing it never pays off. Japan has been in a long history, thousands of years. It's always been on the little side as a small island nation off of this great empire. But over the last 100 years, obviously, Japan, from an economic and kind of military perspective, has advanced. And so now it's in a very interesting situation where its largest security ally is with the United States on a collision course with its largest economic partner in China. In some ways, all of Europe and NATO is in the same bucket here. It is good for China to invest. It's good that the Chinese economy is growing, but it represents a clear and present danger, as we've heard throughout this conference, to certain liberal values that I agree 100% with the panelists, that you can't assume the Western way of doing things is the only way. In Asia, there's a real sense that there's a hubristic tone to American and Western thinkers. So listening and also being clear with your intentions and being able to have a clear understanding of what your security alliances are, what you're willing to go to war over, and what you will do if they take certain steps. We're going to see that in a significant way in the Taiwan Straits, in Hong Kong. So the question is, where do the Europeans, Americans, the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific like-minded allies come together on here? So I think that the Japanese experience is very instructive. You don't see the Japanese out in front, but they're very quietly behind the scenes. They want to find ways to partner more with NATO. I hope that countries like India, Japan, Australia, the other Indo-Pacific countries come together. It's not just the Japanese way of doing it. It really is more of an Asian approach as opposed to a more European or maybe American transatlantic approach. So I think that we are going to see more of this play out in the next 10 years. The world, all of us watching today, are going to spend a lot more time thinking about Asia. So I'm glad that NATO's having the conversation now. We have a lot more to discuss, obviously, so we can have more solutions, not just the excellent questions that have been raised today.
Joshua, thank you so much. I think there's more there than we were possibly able to get into. I'm just thinking here about Alice's comments about state competition and resilience. And I think the point about tech decoupling and the way that interacts with the question of resilience, which is the subject of another, I think, breakout panel, is very, very important. Amrita, on the thinking about NATO in the context of other multilateral institutions and how multilateralism has fared, and Joshua's point on the Asian way. So thank you so much. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Amrita. Thank you, Joshua, for your time. And I think we'll have to close it there.
My name is Katerina Kurtisova. I'm 31 years old and I'm from Slovakia. climate change, irregular migration, resource scarcity, or pandemics. I look forward to learning more about NATO, to meeting and collaborating with other young professionals from across 30 member states, and for us to jointly run our ideas past NATO officials and external experts.
My name is Don Cedar, I'm 31 years old, and I have a Dutch nationality. We're looking at a time where security threats are shifting, in geographically wise, climate wise, when it comes to the political challenges, but also the digital threats. And for a time like this, I think it's very crucial that we can rely on strong partnerships, and that's why the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is very important, and it's time to really invest in the partnerships of the allies of the NATO.
Hello everyone, I'm Eugenia Joni, 33 years old, and I am from Albania. In 2030, in my opinion, will find NATO intensifying its efforts in one of the main threats happening in the cyber domain. It's essential in protecting stability and fundamental in guaranteeing our security. NATO responds to hybrid threats because, in my opinion, it affirms the readiness capability of NATO to adapting against new security challenges.
Welcome back, and I hope you've enjoyed your discussions. From the ones that I've seen here on Channel 1, they look absolutely fascinating, so I hope you've had a good afternoon. We're heading into the home stretches now, but before we do our wrap-up and concluding remarks, we do have time for one final polling question. And that question is, how would you describe NATO in one word? How would you describe NATO in one word? So please do vote now. This is an open question, but don't overthink it because we do not have all night. So please vote now in one word, describe NATO. And you may vote now. In case the message isn't coming through strongly enough, so far cooperation and security seem to be quite popular choices. And alliance, which is good. And I think we'll be closing the panel in the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And actually, it's more of a word cloud, isn't it? So if we could just close the word cloud, please, so final entries are submitted. And it hasn't changed much. So cooperation and security are the two words that are coming most to your minds when you're being asked to describe NATO, followed by alliance and some other words which are way down there in terms of the priorities that you're putting on them. So cooperation, security, and alliance. I'm sure the organisers of today's event will be very happy to hear that. Now, thank you all very much for taking part in that. It gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Wolfgang Ischinger, who is, of course, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, to say the final words and to wrap up today's event for us with some closing remarks.
Thank you so much. It is my privilege to participate at the end of what I think was a wonderful an important session. My team at the Munich Security Conference and I personally, we are extremely proud having been invited by Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to help organize this first NATO Youth Summit, and I think that it's already quite clear this isn't going to be the last one. My friends, on this very day, 31 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. A year later, we had the reunification celebrations right here in Berlin, where I am speaking from. A couple of years later, the Soviet Union disintegrated. The Cold War was finally over. Peace, for all of us, appeared to be at hand. As recently as 2013, we thought that we would move toward mutual security. On the 50th anniversary of the Munich Security Conference, we published an entire volume about that very subject. Now, as you all know, and that's been the discussion, of course, today, dramatic changes have created extreme turbulences in our world. And I was fascinated by the discussion an hour or two ago about how we need to think very hard, for example, about whether and how to include non-state actors into our security deliberations, because non-state actors, for reasons having to do with technological advances, for reasons having to do with cyber and hybrid threats to our security, non-state actors are playing a role today in international security, which was almost unthinkable as recently as a generation ago. We've been moving from the application of kinetic energy in conflicts, in other words, shooting at each other, to disinformation wars, to cyber technology. And of course, we've also been moving from a classic, at least here in Europe, from a classic East-West military confrontation with such elements as nuclear deterrence to far more global challenges and threats that we're confronted by today. So when I see that more than 900 young people from over 70 countries have participated in this event today, I am convinced, I'm really delighted that we can count on you to tackle these challenges ahead and to adapt to these dramatic changes by changing ourselves. That is what Jens Stoltenberg said at the beginning of this conference. We need to keep changing, absolutely. Be assured, let me come to the end. Be assured we will try to pick up these questions, these challenges, these threats, especially the new ones, at the events organized by the Munich Security Conference, including, of course, especially our annual flagship event in February each year. And we will make sure to try to continue involving you and your generation as much as we can. There are already a number of activities going on. We have the Munich Young Leaders Program, which we are administering together with the Kerber Foundation. We have a Junior Ambassadors Program. And last not least, and I'm looking at those among you who are maybe involved with a PhD program or so, we have the McCain Award of the Munich Security Conference, which we give annually to outstanding doctoral dissertations dealing with aspects of transatlantic security and transatlantic cooperation. You can still apply until the 1st of December for next year's award. So don't miss the opportunity. Let me conclude by saying that I'm so grateful to all the speakers, to the NATO leaders, to the think tankers, to the moderators, and to those among you who asked interesting questions or gave comments. The NATO team has again been a wonderful ally in putting this format together. I can't wait for the next project. And last not least, let me thank my own team at the Munich Security Conference. With an average age of 29, they are actually a pretty good fit for this particular program. We will not drop the ball. We will keep pushing, and we will remind current leaders of the expectations and needs of future leaders, of all of you. Thank you very much for participating. Back to Laura. Thank you very much.
Wolfgang Ischinger, Chairman of the Munich Security Conference, thank you for joining us from Berlin. Now, before we wrap up completely, I just want to give you a sneak preview of a new video series that NATO's launching tomorrow on World Science Day for Peace and Development. NATO Science highlights NATO-supported researchers across the alliance who are developing projects at the cutting edge of technological innovation, from stratospheric radar balloons to super healing bandages. Be sure to follow the NATO social media and channels tomorrow for more. In the meantime, have a look at this quick clip.
From high-tech healing bandages to stratospheric eyes in the sky, NATO scientists are working on new technologies every day that make us safer. Whether you're obsessed with robots or crazy about gaming, NATO scientists are working on it. Join me, Dylan White, as we explore the cutting edge of innovation in our new series, NATO Science.
And you can catch more of that tomorrow on the NATO social media channels. Well, that brings us to the end of today's event. So thank you all very much for taking part. And please do continue the conversation afterwards using the hashtag NATO2030 on the different social media channels. It just brings me to say one final thing. From wherever and however you're watching, do have a good afternoon or a good evening. Good night.